Sitcom families used to like each other. They used to be the unit on which the dom-com was built upon, a solid foundation, where the father was a Renaissance man of morals and life advice, the mother was supportive and doting, but not too doting, and the kids were spaced apart just enough to give a variety of nostalgia to a wide audience, and plenty of miscellaneous relatives to fill out as many celebrity guest spots as the network could fill. And then, The Simpsons happened. Sure, there were plenty of shows that put dysfunction on the air prior to that yellow family, but no show was quite so genre-defining as Matt Groening's masterpiece of television. I've already written before about how the landscape of the medium can be defined into a pre- and post-Simpsons era, so if you want to hear me rant for 11 hours about that, you can look at the rest of my channel. But needless to say, the deconstruction of so many genre conventions caused a fundamental shift in the way audiences viewed television. But was that shift really an entirely positive thing? Art reflects reality, and reality reflects art. We started to see ourselves in television just as much as we saw television influencing ourselves. And then TV dads all became bumbling Homers, the moms became nagging background dressing like Marge, and the kids had to one-up whatever Bart Simpson got up to last week. And as this absurdity arms race ramped up, we saw just as much gained as lost. Sure, storylines were becoming Mozart-esque in the sense that the absurd allowed the realism to stand out more, but these factors affected one another in a way that caused some of the relatability to be lost. Namely, people who actually liked their family stopped seeing TV about themselves. People who stayed more domestic in their lives stopped seeing TV as anything but a form of escapism rather than introspection. And so it would take a real show to come along and put everything back into place without immediately rejecting all the other changes made over the previous decade. In comes the Belcher family. This retrospective will be split into individual episode reviews, which themselves are split into two sections. The first to recap the episode's events, and the second to cover themes and motifs and whatever else comes to mind. Season 1. During the development of home movies, showrunner Lauren Bouchard began working on the concept that would become Bob's Burgers. It was a direct response to the lack of what he referred to as blue-collar creatives being seen on television. Most families depicted were often upper-middle class or in some unique financial position, meant to be relatable in as many aspects as possible, rather than having a closer focus on character dynamics. In his attempts to create this sort of aesthetic in his work, Bouchard teamed up with Jim Dotree, best known for his production work on King of the Hill, and a show that is very similar to Bob's Burgers conceptually in its focus on realistic, character-driven narratives over shock humor or gross-out gags, something many other adult comedies were notorious for at the time. And perhaps this notoriety ended up doing Bob's Burgers some harm as collateral. The first season of the show is distinct from the rest not solely in its use of Adobe Flash animation, but in the shaky tone and characterization of the cast. The Belcher family got into situations more similar to the darker scenes one would see in a contemporary show, and the togetherness they were known for in later seasons wasn't quite there yet. In fact, the series was originally planned to have the Belchers a family of cannibals, serving human flesh in their restaurant. This was scrapped in favor of the later concept for the show that was much lighter in tone, though many early episodes still kept some beats from this initial premise. Overall, Bob's Burgers' first season had mixed reviews upon its release, despite the high viewership numbers deleted from The Simpsons gave it. The concepts behind many episodes were viewed with hesitation by its critics, and this was a criticism that was taken to heart, giving the first season a distinct vibe from the rest of the show that itself stood out for most television tonally anyway. Human flesh. Celebrating their grand reopening on Labor Day weekend, Bob tries to give the family a pep talk in anticipation of what needs to be a busy day, though Linda starts to grow upset with the fact that it's their anniversary and Bob has forgotten. The kids are set to do various tasks around the restaurant, but mess them up in various ways, culminating in the health inspector, Hugo, arriving on rumors that Louise started about the food containing human flesh. But when Hugo finds out that his ex-fiancée Linda is married to the restaurant owner, he puts up a warning about human flesh in the burgers, driving customers away. This is made worse by Linda's attempts to talk Hugo out of displaying the warning going awry when a corpse from Mort's crematorium next door winds up inside the restaurant. An angry mob starts to protest outside the restaurant, which Bob attempts to placate, though his attempts only make them believe he's defending cannibalism, and soon the window is shattered by a thrown snow globe. Bob laments his failure to run a restaurant, but his family reassures him that they're still proud of him regardless, and the day is later saved when a group of exploratory eaters arrives, inquiring about the human meat. Ultimately, Bob is able to use the sales from that day to take Linda on a proper anniversary date. As I stated before, the initial concept of Bob's Burgers was that the family would be cannibals passing off human meat to their customers. This episode's plot is a relic of that initial concept, as well as containing reference to the direction the show took instead. Here, the Belchers are disgusted at the accusations made towards them and set out to disprove them to calm down the crowd. And yet this is an accusation made not to them, but by them. Louise was hoping to impress her classmates and came up with a more interesting story about her family, something much more interesting than the mundane life they lived in currently. And yet this mundanity is precisely the point of the show. Rather than cannibals, they're real. It's not that there's a credible threat to their business's reputation, but a scorned former lover who was trying to go on some sort of vindictive rampage. But in the end, it wasn't logic or a calm emotional response that saved the day. In fact, Bob's attempts to calm the crowd only backfired, but an embrace of the absurdity that managed to fix the issue. A bus full of cannibals saves the restaurant. An uncanny end to an uncanny story about a normal family. Crawl space. Linda's parents, Gloria and Al, are coming over to visit Linda and asks Bob to fix a leak in the ceiling in anticipation of their arrival. While he's up there fixing it, Bob finds a hole in the ceiling that he can use to get into the crawl space between the walls, that he climbs into, then proceeds to take advantage of the fact that everyone seems to think he's stuck back there. The kids use the situation to get into trouble in various ways, with Jean sampling his grandparents in their bed together for a school project, Louise pretending her father is dead, and Tina sneaking into her school's walls to nap. After turning Teddy away when the guy comes over to get him out, Bob finds out that he's actually stuck back there, and Linda decides to leave him there to teach him a lesson. Bob slowly starts to go crazy inside the walls, taking to Louise's coochie-copy flashlight and hallucinating a la The Shining. Eventually, Mr. Frond, the school's counselor, comes over for a wellness check where he finds out that Bob isn't actually dead, just hiding from his family, and Gloria decides to take matters into her own hands, calling the fire department and getting Bob out of the wall. She then defends the family's dysfunction to Frond, calling him out for not knowing how crazy a family can make you act. Just because you love somebody doesn't mean you have to like them. Bob is a family man in this show, the kind of guy who would never do anything to harm his family, at least not directly. This kind of mentality is best shown early in the episode, the kids pushing the ladder around as he scolds them, or later when he apologizes for insulting Linda for nagging, only for them to bond over some of the insults actually being pretty funny. Even through the arguments they have with one another, they still have a deep-seated respect for each other, enough that nothing ever seems to be permanent. But then how do you resolve the two ideas of not wanting to hurt your family and not wanting to spend time around them? Here, Bob is able to find a middle ground of faking an incident beyond his control, that he's not actively avoiding Linda's mother out of a desire to hurt her or a lack of caring about her feelings, which she's clearly nervous about trying to ensure things are perfect. And while this is more of an early seasons Bob type of a tribute and outright running from his problems, there's still a bit of him shining through. Though there are still clear signs of other characters being implemented in an incomplete way, like Gloria actually coming to Bob's defense, and Mr. Frond being much more skittish and manipulated by the kids. Sacred Cow. The Belcher family is on their way to celebrating their 100,000th burger served, only for a documentary filmmaker, Randy Watkins, to arrive on their front doorstep with a steer named Moo-Lissa and a countdown timer to when the cow will be ground into meat. The family's nonplussed, Gene attempting to get his music used as the film's soundtrack, while Louise tricks Tina into thinking the cow is trying to communicate with poop emojis. And the stunt of having a cow outside the restaurant only winds up driving even more business to Bob's. But later on a rainy night, Bob sees Moo-Lissa out in the cold and rescues her from the elements, with the cow staying inside the house. He tries to pretend that Randy's guilt trip didn't work on him until Linda manages to get the cow out of the house, where she is stolen. So the family and the film crew team up to rescue Moo-Lissa from a nearby petting zoo whose owners stole the steer, and they're all reunited back at the porch front. Then Moo-Lissa has a heart attack after almost getting hit by a car. Bob passes out and hallucinates that Moo-Lissa is giving him his blessing to create his 100,000th burger out of the dead cow. Bob ends up seeing a cow up close and begins to feel a closer relationship with it, a natural response to anybody with repressed guilt seeing a problem up close. Most people know already that every large meat industry has inhumane treatment of the animals, not purely in terms of eating them, but the way they live leading up to their slaughter. Because this is not something that one has to confront on a regular basis, however, it's also something that's easy to ignore until it's directly in front of your face. Bob feels guilty about serving beef in his burgers, and yet he's really only a small cog in a much larger machine, made up of far too many moving parts to make any one party culpable, not even oneself. If he didn't sell burgers, the demand for beef would simply be filled elsewhere. If he tried to source his meat from more humane businesses, he would have to raise prices to accommodate, and then the demand for cheap beef would simply be filled elsewhere. The Belchers are an average family, powerless to create large-scale change, but not to await an opportunity to make smaller ones. Bob's guilt over creating burgers is enough that he's open to change later, even if the opportunity doesn't present itself. And so all he really has to do is all he can do, which is basically nothing. Sexy dance fighting. Tina is lamenting the fact that she's going through puberty, as well as Bob making her work the grill as father-daughter time, while the younger kids are out having fun. But when they discover a capoeira class taking place nearby and bring Tina along, she immediately falls for the dance instructor, Gyro. Tina enrolls in the class much to Bob's annoyance, as she continuously skips her work obligations to spend more and more time dance fighting. And when he goes to the dance class to pick her up, Gyro becomes insulted about Bob's lack of support for his daughter and the fact that he's compared capoeira to jazzercise. Gyro attacks Bob and knocks him to the ground where he voids his bowels, becoming too embarrassed to show his face around there again when it's time for Tina's Troika de Gordoes. But when Teddy compares the ceremony to the moment where Tina becomes a woman, Bob decides to go over there anyway, only for Gyro to fail Tina when he sees her father arrive, as he still hates the guy. Bob steps in to defend Tina, only to get attacked repeatedly, knocked down again and again, as the onlookers stop rooting for Gyro and start to root for Bob. In the end, despite losing the fight, Tina appreciates that Bob stood up for what she wanted and announces that she's not going to capoeira anymore, as the instructor was a jerk. Bob is hoping to spend more time with Tina while also being pragmatic about his intentions in doing so, keeping her working at the restaurant alongside him to bond on proximity. But Tina is growing up, and a part of getting older means drifting away from your parents and their lifestyle. Bob takes offense to this, as if this universal truth to puberty was something inherent to his and Tina's relationship instead of the natural curiosity a teenager is bound to have. This curiosity, combined with Tina's already confusing puberty and lack of fulfillment from mundanity, manifests as a fascination with sexy dance fighting. Yet Bob's real issue with Tina's new obsession is not so much that he finds the new dance form abhorrent, but rather that he finds the very fact that she's seeking new hobbies as a sign that he's no longer able to keep her interest. Teddy misinterprets the Troca de Gordoes as Tina's coming-of-age ceremony, and despite being wrong about the ceremony itself, he's correct in what it represents. If Bob doesn't support Tina in this, then will she even bother to notify him when she really does come of age? Because it's not about her doing the same things as him, it's about doing these things together. Hamburger Dinner Theater. Linda goes out to a dinner theater bachelorette party where she's bit by the dinner theater bug and decides that she wants to put on her own dinner theater performance after a bit of prodding from Mort. Bob is against it, but lets her put on a 3-day performance involving the kids anyway, with each one being assigned a part, including Tina, whose stage fright usually prevents her from speaking in front of others. The first night is a disaster when Mort overdoes it with the gore effects, but after tweaking the show a bit, they're finally able to put on a performance that the audience hates due to the poorly planned twists and lackluster delivery. That is, until a man breaks into the restaurant mid-performance and demands the money in the register, eventually breaking into song when Gene plays him off. Linda is happy about the success of the performance, but Bob is angry that they were robbed, with the robber getting away due to the police thinking it was part of the show. But later the robber returns to the scene of the crime to try to hear the reviews, and Bob calls the police, who get him this time. Linda's upset that the star of the show is arrested, and the next night she puts on a soulless performance until Bob arrives to steal the show by reenacting the robbery from the previous night. Although the guests aren't pleased with Bob's performance, Linda is still happy that she finally got her husband to act. Bob seems to hate the idea of dinner theater, not so much because of the theater itself, but due to the effect it has on Linda. It distracts her. She sings everything, she dances in the restaurant, and she works less efficiently. Namely, Bob views it as a distraction, something pointless. He doesn't like it, and he doesn't get why other people like it. In fact, the dinner theater fiasco even starts to actively hurt the family business as it provides cover for them being robbed and drives a few customers out of the store before that. This is part of why Bob is incredulous when Linda views the theater as a success. They lost a day's worth of sales during the event, meaning the entire ordeal was a total financial failure, money being the only objective measurement of success one can place. But after seeing the difference between the mentality of a post-robbery Linda and the post-catching Linda, Bob finally finds out that some things aren't meant to be measured in such objective terms, not even his own performance as the robber. The play ends up being a flop, but it was never about the performance, but the idea of one. Sheesh, Cab Bob. Tina's 13th birthday is coming up, and she wants the party to be big, including her crush, Jimmy Pesto Jr., coming over to give her her first kiss. Bob knows he can't afford the party, so he gets work from his landlord driving a cab overnight to get the extra cash. While he's driving, he's repeatedly exposed to the underbelly of the town, and eventually befriends 3 transvestite prostitutes, as he's one of the only cabbies in town who will pick them up. After several nights of driving, he's eventually able to raise the money for Tina's party, only to find out that Jimmy Jr. cannot come due to his father's long-standing rivalry with Bob, and the fact that he refuses to allow his son to go over unless Bob shaves his mustache. Tina gets angry over the fact that her father refuses to humiliate himself in front of his business rival for her sake and sulks about it the whole party, at least until Bob unwittingly invites the prostitute over and they mention how many sacrifices Bob has already made for her sake. Bob ultimately gives in to shaving his mustache with a bit of help from maybe drugs, but Tina says that he never needed to do this. In the end, Bob learns from the prostitutes that Jimmy Pesto is a diaper enjoyer, and Bob is able to blackmail him into letting his son come over, where Tina is able to use the kissing training Louise gave to her to enjoy her ascent into womanhood. Tina allegedly goes from a girl to a woman in this episode, and her mentality towards her father's sacrifices matures as she does. Early on, she acts like a spoiled child, demanding more and more out of Bob that he's eager to give her in order to ensure that she has everything she wants. But as she gets to her later years, she starts to reduce the number of demands she makes as Tina learns that her wants are not as important as her needs. She doesn't need to kiss Jimmy Pesto Jr., but she needs a father who's willing to put in the work to get her closer to him. It's not as though Bob is needlessly losing out in this exchange either. As much as he drives himself, pun not intended, to the point of exhaustion in this episode, he's also doing so in the interest of proving things to his daughter during a time when she's reevaluating her thoughts on life. Maybe an adult shouldn't be babied so much, but it's nice to know that somebody is willing to go through with things they ought not to have to for you. That the exchange of common courtesy can be a little bit rigid between people. Sometimes you give more than you can for another person, and as long as they recognize the sacrifices that you're making and acknowledge that they are temporary, then you have a solid foundation for any relationship. Bed and breakfast. Bob and Linda rent out some of the rooms in their house as a bed and breakfast over the weekend in spite of Bob's warnings that Linda tends to take these things overboard. They host Javed, an entomologist studying beetle mating habits, and the Samuels, who mostly want to be left alone in their room. Linda attempts to get the guests to socialize with one another, but they're too busy to play board games or participate in social events. And when complaining about this, Teddy says that he would be a perfect guest. With no rooms for the guy, Linda leases out Louise's bedroom, something she does not take well as she begins to plot her revenge by using Javed's beetles and some pheromones. But Teddy doesn't seem to mind having his face stung by insects as he mentions that nothing gets to him, except for costumed characters, making Louise hatch the idea to invite a bunch over to the house to harass him. After the house is infested by beetles, the guests all try to leave, so Linda locks them in their rooms, with plans to let them out for the ice cream social later that day. It's not until Teddy starts assaulting the costumed characters in the bug-infested hallways that Linda finally breaks down as Bob points out she was not a great host, though she was at least able to blackmail a good review from the Samuels after they were trapped following a failed escape attempt. Linda has a habit of trying too hard in most of what she does, a habit that often winds up making situations far worse than they ought to have been, even if they start out well. As she continuously puts more and more of herself into a project, Linda grows frustrated when she does not get the same amount out in return. She expects her passion to be contagious and expects the people around her to recognize her hard work, no matter how misguided it is. And this sort of mentality is not always viewed in a negative light. Bob's actions through this episode are largely about taking a hands-off approach to the B&B, to let Linda manage the project in spite of his misgivings about it. He recognizes his wife's passion projects for what they are and never considers this passion to be negative, but also knows that it's up to her to manage her responses should something not go according to plan. He doesn't swoop in to clean up the mess when Linda's B&B goes wrong, merely talking her into finishing what she started. It shows that you can support a person emotionally without condoning what they do with that praise. Art Crawl. It's the annual art crawl, with various paintings being displayed across the boardwalk. This stretches to Bob's Burgers, that is currently hosting a series of paintings made by Linda's unstable sister Gail that, to Bob's horror, are all various portraits of animal anuses. As nobody wants to eat at the Butt restaurant, Bob schemes to replace the portraits with art made by his children, though when Edith Cranwinkle, the chairperson of the art crawl, compliments his removal of the butt paintings, he grows indignant and places them back around his restaurant. But the next day, Bob is horrified to discover that somebody has painted underwear over all the works in his restaurant, and he demands that Edith acknowledge and apologize for doing this, culminating in a rampage where he paints anuses on all the art in her shop. Bob is nearly arrested for the vandalism until Linda confesses that she was the one to paint underwear on the animals, as she didn't have the heart to tell Gail that she disliked her works. Louise is able to pay for the damaged art using money she made by exploiting the labor of nearby children, and the episode ends with everyone agreeing to be more honest with Gail, at least until she shows off her new, much worse paintings and they lie about the quality. At the end of the episode, Linda is shamed for lying to her sister about her artistic abilities, and it's pointed out that the whole conflict could have been avoided if she was more honest up front. And yet, even before the twist of irony at the episode's end, Bob was still trying to circumvent the truth with schemes to get his children's artwork over the anus pictures. He himself was lying not only to Gail, but to Linda about his intentions. And then he's untruthful later on when he's told not to put the pictures back up, despite that being his goal in the first place. Through both of those encounters, it's clear what the real motivation behind Bob's actions were from the start. He just wanted control over his restaurant. While having anuses on the wall scaring customers away is clearly something any business owner would want to avoid, he reveals that he didn't actually care too much about the lack of business in the first place, as he's willing to continue to scare off customers in the interest of not doing what he's told with what he owns. Bob values the idea of his restaurant more than he values the restaurant himself, and he has every reason to do so, as it's the culmination of his life's work. Spaghetti Western and Meatballs. After pulling a few strings, Linda is able to get Bob's Burgers the job of catering a charity for Tina's Conflict Resolution Club. Meanwhile, Bob is busy spending more and more time watching old westerns with Jean, much to the annoyance of Louise, who is no longer the center of his attention. So when Jean starts to mimic the actions of Banjo, the hero of the film series they're watching, Louise riles him up in order to convince him to attack his rival Choo Choo for finishing all his jokes, starting a food fight that gets them both detention. When Bob goes to pick up his kids from school, he ends up fighting Mr. Frond and losing the catering gig, much to the annoyance of Linda, who was hoping to rub the success in the face of Colleen, who catered last year's event. So the kids are sent to detention, where Louise starts egging on Jean even more, resulting in him getting into a fight with Choo Choo after school that Bob has to break up. But his breaking up the fight is misinterpreted by Choo Choo's father, who tries to fight Bob. Bob, Louise, and Jean end up hiding from the others, where Bob admits that he's not doing his best as a father to all his kids, while Louise is also acting too childish. Then he fixes everything the only way he knows how, by serving spaghetti at the event anyway, where the food's able to break up several ongoing fights. The ABS system is made fun of repeatedly through this episode, from Tina's half-assed implementation during the conflict resolution skit, to Mr. Frond's failure to abide by his own rules when given the chance to use them. But when Bob tries to fix things, the first thing he does is try to access his feelings, and that's all it takes to stop a bunch of fights. One reading of this ending is that people through the episode have always eagerly taken the low road in their conflicts. Tina picks a fight with Jocelyn over a perceived slight involving Jimmy Jr. Louise tries to pit other people against one another out of jealousy. Jean is quick to exaggerate his conflicts with Choo Choo, and yet none of these actions do anything to make the conflicts any better off. Tina gets hit back, Louise gets caught up in a chase scene, Jean ends up getting into a fight. And even Bob gets his catering gig taken away when he responds to Mr. Frond's provocations. It's not until he makes an attempt at an apology, not even a full apology, just being open to one, that all the conflicts end as people realize they've been taking the low road the whole time. Burger Wars. After nearly choking to death in the restaurant, Mr. Fischoeder, the landlord for the boardwalk, tells the Belcher family that they have 2 days to come up with their missing rent money or else he'll sell the store to Jimmy Pesto across the way. Bob tries to confront his business rival about the attempted takeover and their rivalry, but the children of both families don't seem to share this sentiment. Tina just wants to slow dance with Jimmy Jr., who seems to have forgotten that they're dating. Gene wants to play his first real gig, and Louise wants to use voodoo to save the restaurant. But Bob and Linda hand out flyers instead for half off, which backfires when Jimmy Pesto puts up an offer to match the prices, and then some, while also expanding his menus to sell burgers. Bob has had enough and heads over to confront him again, finding the rest of his family at the other restaurant as he calls them out for being traitors. And when he attempts to hand out free samples of his masterpiece, the Meat Saya, Pesto fights him, which spills out into the street. Mr. Fischoeder sees the fighting and takes bets on it, and when the fighting turns into a draw, he goes to Bob's Burgers to deliver the news. But when he tries one of the choking hazard-free samples, he's in love with what he considers art, so much that he gives them a bit more leeway in the end. Mr. Fischoeder is an eccentric man. The narrative even mentions this explicitly. And yet, for all of his weirdness, they still have to put up with his antics due to the fact that he's rich. If Fischoeder was working class, he might be labeled as crazy, and his antics would be dismissed as a lunatic's attempts at fun, but he owns a lot of property, so the rivalry between Bob and Jimmy gets ramped up at his prodding, all something simply hand-waved as a reasonable demand to make. And it's ultimately this eccentricity that saved the restaurant at the episode's conclusion. Bob only gets to keep the store because his burgers were viewed as an art form by the man, despite this art form being something that's not at all profitable. This conclusion plays a lot into the tropey endings, where the humble artist is able to show up the soulless profit monger by putting care into their work. But the messaging is underlined by the fact that it's not the people at large demanding quality, but one guy who happens to have a lot of power over who thrives and who starves. Weekend at Mort's. Green mold is found inside of Bob's Burgers, and Hugo orders the restaurant closed for the weekend while it's decontaminated. They're invited to spend the weekend at Mort's, with the mortician even volunteering to watch the kids while Bob and Linda get to enjoy their honeymoon that they never got. But Bob mostly wants to lounge around in sweatpants, building model kits instead of going out to do things. But when the kids encourage Mort to send a message to a woman he met on a mortician's dating site, he invites the other couple on a double date at Jimmy Pesto's, while Tina is put in charge of babysitting. Louise takes advantage of the opportunity to pull pranks on her siblings while they explore the morgue, culminating in a real fright when a drunken Bob stumbles home from a boring night out to take a nap, finally falling asleep in one of the coffins. When the kids hear him snoring in there, they think he's a zombie and push the coffin into the crematorium, nearly burning their dad to death. Enlightened by his near-death experience, Bob realizes he shouldn't have left Linda alone at Jimmy's and rushes over to salsa dance with her, discovering some green mold on the wall there in the process. Bob is, on the surface, a pretty simple guy. He has his dreams, and he's living them, running a burger restaurant with his family and continuing in this lifestyle for, according to Linda, the past 10 consecutive years without any days off. This sort of life is Bob's comfort zone, the thing that he wants to do forever. But this is not a sentiment shared by the rest of his family, who have dreams and ambitions of their own, often working against some of Bob's own desires. Linda wishes to explore the world, take salsa dancing classes, go out for a honeymoon, and enjoy their life together instead of stagnating. Tina, too, has a sort of comfort, but coming from the opposite end, in the sense that she doesn't know what kind of life she wants to have, and is paralyzed with the number of decisions she could make, more often than not assuming that any change may make things worse, so they're not worth doing. Trying to take charge of an adventure when babysitting is far too much for her to do until she's egged on by Louise, and then she starts to fear a zombie attack so much she almost burns her father alive. This experience affects Bob just as much as it affects Tina. Both characters realize that living the dream can sometimes mean not living at all, and that changing things up, even for the worst, at least makes their life more interesting. Lobsterfest. It's Lobsterfest, a holiday that Bob resents so much that he forbids his children from ever eating lobster or attending the festivities, as it's a holiday where everyone is consuming seafood and nobody wants a burger. But when a tropical storm blows in, the festivities are closed, and Bob, being the only restaurant open, finds himself sheltering dozens and dozens of patrons who all want a drink and a meal. He celebrates intensely at his success despite the fact that the power is out and they can't charge for any of the burgers. The next day, however, he wakes up to a thrashed restaurant and no money raised from the previous night, though he's still optimistic about people returning to help fix the damage, at least until he sees that Lobsterfest is back on. Meanwhile, the kids sneak out to go looting, although all they really manage to find is a lobster who they're unsure about eating until it falls into their boiling pot. Back at Lobsterfest, Bob takes to the stage and asks for people to fix his restaurant, but when he's rebuked, he grows angry and threatens to contaminate the butter, falling in on accident. When the mob threatens to throw him into the shell pile, Hugo steps up and calms him down by testing the butter and finding it within acceptable range, something he only did as he remembered Bob wingmanning for him the night before. Like trying to fight a windmill, declaring war on a concept or event rarely turns out well, especially in small numbers when no one agrees or sympathizes with your plight. A more profit-minded person would have used Lobsterfest as a chance to go out of their way to appeal to the seafood-hating family members dragged along on the trip, by having a mobile grill or taking orders and giving numbers. But Bob's approach is to simply stick to his guns and silently resent the event as he stews in his restaurant. This can be considered an emotional low point. An emotional high point would come later, when the event is not only cancelled, but the patrons are moved into his restaurant. He gets everything he wants all at once, while the people he resents are distraught. In this split between the two emotional states, Bob ends up going overboard as he starts to celebrate victory too much, getting the restaurant into trouble while surrounded by people who don't get where he's coming from, as they went from a highlight to a highlight. But thankfully, Bob is saved by a reciprocated act of kindness from Hugo, his payback for when Bob used his euphoria to briefly cease reveling in his own happiness and to instead help out someone else with their own. Torpedo. Bob takes the family to a baseball game to see an advertisement they put up, only for Gene to instead discover the sport of mascot racing, and Bob to learn that his favorite pitcher, Torpedo, is in the minor leagues. He's able to convince Torpedo to pull strings to get Gene into the mascot races, where Gene is able to win, a good chance to advertise the restaurant, although Gene forgets the name of Bob's Burgers. But what is good advertising is Torpedo enjoying one of Bob's burgers so much that he invites several players over to eat there, encouraging Tina to get him food before every game. Bob is happy that his favorite athlete is promoting his restaurant until Torpedo's real motivation is revealed. He was simply using the burger grease to cheat by coating the balls in it. Mr. Fishodor convinces Bob to look the other way and allow the crowd to enjoy the spectacle even if it's dishonest, and this lesson is passed on to the children, who encourage Gene to push the other mascots over to win using the same logic. But when Bob tries and fails to convince Torpedo to stop cheating, only to learn that the guy's been cheating his whole career, he takes it upon himself to tell Gene not to cut corners, only for Gene to get shoved over instead at the end of the third race. It seems as though his lesson on doing things properly is going to fail until the pier's roller coaster falls over due to lacking supports, and Mr. Fishodor declares that he admires Bob for not doing things the way he himself does. A slightly schmaltzy ending to the episode that comes from somewhat of a contrivance, not insofar as the coaster collapsing, but the fact that it fell at just the right moment to have Gene learn a lesson that he was barely receptive to in the first place. Torpedo has a successful career from cheating with various forms of grease. Gene is able to win by sabotaging the other mascots, and Fishodor wins at life by cheating at safety and standards. Bob is the only person who doesn't get to win in this episode because he plays fair and legitimately, with his offers to share his ideology all being rebuked. But while this is the sort of thing that makes Bob look good, part of it is also done out of necessity. Fishodor owns so much of the area that if something breaks he can afford to fix it, often at less of a cost than the money he made from cutting the corner in the first place. And Torpedo was able to build a whole career and signature move out of cheating, the only person to be hurt being Bob when he realized his idol was a fraud. So when Bob cuts corners, he has more to lose, as more of his wealth would be built upon that lie. No washed-up career to lose, no slight loss of profit, just a tank to his reputation, which is all he has. Season 2. After the mixed reviews of the first season, Season 2 came out looking stronger than before, with the cast of side characters starting to come into their own spotlights as the showrunners finally figured out what really made the show click. It took the first season to iron out character traits and details, giving the cast much more consistency moving forward, something reinforced by the fact that Bob's Burgers as a show saw very little movement of its cast and crew. People who were on board from the beginning more or less stuck around through the present day. The other big change from Season 1 to Season 2 is the shift from flash animation to Toon Boom that gave a moderate increase in animation quality. Although Bob's Burgers was never a show about impressing anyone visually, actually going to the opposite extreme of using flat simulations of a single camera format to give the family a more grounded aesthetic that reinforces the more human aspects of the characters. The Belchies. Caffrey's Taffies, an abandoned taffy factory, is set to be demolished when the Belcher kids learn from Teddy about a treasure hidden beneath it in the old bootlegger's tunnels. They sneak out to find this treasure, with Tina inviting Jimmy Jr., who invites Zeke and the twins, and the 7 of them enter the factory where they quickly find a secret elevator shaft. They're trapped inside for a bit until Louise and the twins manage to crawl out of a hole and begin to explore. Eventually, the rest of the group is able to sneak out as well, only to find that they're all lost and that Louise is trapped in a pit with a taffy dummy she names Taff. Bob and Linda, having found no success with a pair of sexy dice, realize that their kids are missing and set out to find them after reading Tina's diary, eventually managing to locate Louise as the demolition of the factory begins. Tina, tired of pretending to be helpless like a romance novel protagonist to attract Jimmy Jr., comes up with the scheme to have the group create a human ladder to rescue her, and Jean is able to find a hollow space they can kick their way out of. In the end, the whole group winds up safe, assuming that the treasure wasn't real because the map was shaped like a butt. The Belcher family is incredibly supportive of one another, almost to the point of absurdity, but usually manifesting in a way that allows each character to be a more exaggerated version of themselves without the repression of guilt or shame. Louise is convinced that just because the map is butt-shaped, it doesn't mean that there's no real treasure somewhere, and the other kids are with her on that, leading to the treasure hunt in the first place. Jean consistently makes excess noise by testing the acoustics of the sewers the whole time he's down there, and while another show might have had a character tell him to be quiet, Jean's noise-making here is shown to be just the thing to escape from a dead end. Bob and Linda hear that their kids aren't being loud, and instead of taking advantage of the situation for scheduled lovemaking, check up on them instead of showing relief over peace and quiet. Even Tina gets to learn this lesson as she represses herself in order to try to be more attractive to Jimmy Jr. When she stops holding back, she immediately formulates a plan to rescue her sister so they can get out of the sewers alive. Bob's not even especially upset over the pill Linda slips him at one point, simply asking her not to do it again, though this is likely in part due to wanting to focus on the kids. It goes to show that this support is what makes the Belcher family functional, that they work well together not in spite of their differences, but because of them. Bob Day Afternoon. After failing to get an extension on his loan from the bank, Bob returns to the restaurant only to find out there's a hostage situation going on there. The police set up a temporary headquarters inside of Bob's Burgers, which Bob hopes will get a bit more attention to the store, paying off when the hostage taker, Mickey, demands food with Bob delivering it. But when the police open fire, Bob is trapped inside and becomes another hostage. While inside the bank, he begins to serve as the go-between for the police, as well as Louise, who is writing a paper on Mickey, Jean, who wants to be a drone pilot, and Tina, who wants to get her money out of the bank. But when the police announce that they plan on tear-gassing the bank to get everyone out, Bob takes it upon himself to evacuate the building before then, ultimately convincing Mickey to go out on his own terms. So Mickey makes the hostages form a human shield so he can get to Bob's to have one last burger, celebrating when he's tackled by the police without losing his pants in the process. After the hostage situation, Mr. Dowling announces that he might give Bob the extension on his loan after all, until a die pack left over from the hostages playing banker explodes in his pocket. This is the sort of ending that many of the financially focused episodes of Bob's Burgers have had. The family's money problems never go away, and the writers eschew the narrative of everyone living happily ever after to instead imply that the struggles will go on. Some episodes even end with the restaurant being closed down by a vindictive Hugo or some other force. And while continuity resets will always ensure that the audience can expect the store to be open again before the next episode begins, the one thing that is not reset is the cast. Bob's financial situation might not improve, but his friend circle always seems to catch a few more people from season to season. Mickey gets introduced in this episode and later on becomes a regular presence in the show, popping up from time to time just as so many of Bob's other new friends do. This show is somewhat of a priority when it comes to what sort of wealth the show wants for its cast. That, as sappy as it is, the real measurement of success comes not from how much you're selling, but to who you're selling. Synchronized Swimming. Hoping to get out of their gym class obligations, the Belcher children convince Mr. Frond to allow them to take a synchronized swimming independent study class that they fake their mother's signature to allow. But when Linda discovers that the kids have been skipping class in this way, she internalizes an argument she had with Bob over the fact that she's taken advantage of, and decides that she's going to teach them to swim for real. Bob is upset about this as he recently purchased a soft serve machine and was hoping to have the kids run it over the summer as it's too much work to do it himself. This culminates in an issue where Mr. Frond sets up a graded performance of the kids' swimming skills, threatening them with summer school if they fail it, which also means they won't be around with Bob during peak ice cream season. Bob attempts to guide the class himself, but Louise continuously tries to sabotage the performance, eventually pulling a Caddyshack but for real to get the pool drained. Mr. Frond insists that they dupe the performance in the drained pool just in time for Linda to show up, saving the day by having the kids and Bob do birthing exercises. Linda at first coddles her children too much, happily doing their assignments and keeping them out at the pool instead of working. This creates a sort of feedback loop, where the kids get so used to taking advantage of their mother that they start to develop the life skill of getting her to do the work for them instead of actually learning how to do certain things. After realizing how her kids are treating her, Linda decides to cut them off, to make them fix their own problems for once, until this ends up getting the whole family into a bad situation as they potentially get sent to summer school, making Bob lose a labor source and the kids losing their summer freedom. So there's a conflict set up between Linda's desires to be there for her kids and her desire to set them free so they can learn to fix problems themselves. It becomes clear in this episode that they can't solve the issue alone, they need their mother's help, and part of the reason they can't is because they're so dependent on that help. But also because they don't really have a desire to learn. Why do so when mom is there to do it for you? So Linda finds the best possible option. She helps save the day, but does so in an embarrassing way. Her kids can still depend on her for help, but it would probably be better if they tried to do it themselves first. Burgerboss. Bob gets an arcade machine in the restaurant, Burgerboss, and he starts trying to set high scores. But when Jimmy Pesto comes over to play the game, he not only sets a high score, but does so with the name Bob Sucks, prompting Bob to obsess over beating his score to remove it. But in his obsession, he gets carpal tunnel and has to wear wrist braces and take pain pills to keep playing. Linda removes the machine to stop Bob's obsession, but he tracks it down to a local arcade and brings his kids with him to get inside. The kids are bored of waiting around, so they begin to crash various birthday parties, eventually working their way up to crashing bigger parties like a ball at the local yacht club. Meanwhile, Bob is getting coached by Daryl on how to improve at Burgerboss so he can beat Jimmy's score, somehow agreeing to beat up Daryl's bully for him. Bob, high on pain pills, hallucinates that Daryl's bully is one of the enemies from the game and chases him out of the arcade and onto the yacht club his kids are crashing. Linda's called over to defuse the situation, happy at first because she believed Bob was taking the kids to boating lessons, but when she arrives and sees Bob making an ass of himself, she scolds him and drags him home. In the end, Daryl decides to give up gaming so he doesn't end up like Bob, but not after getting paid to simply beat the score himself. Bob tries to show off his gaming skills to his kids, only for Jimmy Pesto to show up and show him up in short order. As a result, he feels like a loser, though it's in his follow-up actions that actually make him a loser. He gets 2 wrist braces, starts popping pain pills, and eventually chases children around with a paddle. All things that could have been avoided if he had just taken the high road, or even if he had taken the low road, just a slightly higher one, and called Pesto a nerd for being good at a video game for kids. People often find their fates on the road they take to avoid them. Daryl hopes to get Bob to fight his battles for him, only to get bullied even more for avoiding the confrontation. It's not until he decides to give up on trying to define himself by a hobby that he gets made fun of for that he's finally able to presumably overcome the bullying from the other kids. And while it's normally never a good thing to give up on your dreams because of outside pressure, if your dream was only something you were following because you wanted to be famous or popular in the first place, then you're not really giving up anything at all. Just as Bob eventually gives up on his crusade to overwrite a score on a video game, and the problem immediately becomes moot. Food Truckin. Food trucks start parking around the boardwalk, stealing business from Bob's Burgers. So at the advice of Randy, the filmmaker from Sacred Cow, Bob gets a food truck of his own that's little more than a fire hazard on wheels. They don't manage to make much money parked outside their own restaurant, stealing customers from themselves, until Randy points out that the real money is in the circuit, traveling to where people are. So over the next few days, they go from location to location, running the food truck while Linda stays at the restaurant, bored, before deciding to join them on the road at the Lollapalooza, a food truck festival. Tina starts going by Dina after a customer mispronounces her name, and she walks around the festival lying about what's in her samples. Jean and Louise walk around sampling the other food trucks and writing insults about the food there. And Linda starts to develop a road rage habit, knocking the windows off of several other trucks. Eventually, Bob's Burgers wins the Best Truck contest, only for the festival goers to start an angry mob and flip them over. The Belchers wait until the mob dies down, only to wake them up in their attempts to re-flip it, barely managing to escape an inferno before walking home. Bob has a habit of getting in way over his head without realizing it, then doubling down once he notices that he's gone too far, as it hurts his pride too much to back down. Here, he feels as though his burgers are being overshadowed, and, not wanting to stand by and watch his life's work be ignored, buys a truck he can't afford and has it fixed up with money he doesn't have, all in the interest of showing off his food to people he doesn't even respect. His family takes after him in this, with the kids getting involved in various grifts involving their promotion of the truck. Dina, starts to adopt a new personality, never admitting it was a pointless idea and blaming her past actions on a moved hair clip. Louise and Jean likewise have no issue with lying to the hipsters at the food truck festival, as in their own words, they don't find a problem with lying to vegetarians. It's not until the family starts to notice that their actions are hurting their family that anyone begins to show any amount of remorse, backpedaling out of their actions and obligations when the truck is flipped over. While their egos are too large to ever admit any wrongdoings for following their beliefs, they will quickly pivot if someone they care about has their welfare put in jeopardy as a result. Humorously, this manifests as the whole family scapegoating Randy for all their troubles, despite the fact that all he did was enable Bob's desires at the start of the episode, while offering genuinely good-hearted advice throughout. Dr. Yap. Gail visits the restaurant while Bob is at Dr. Yap's, the family dentist, and she volunteers to pick up the kids while Linda manages the restaurant. But while picking up a thoroughly drugged Bob, Gail is confused for Linda and Bob kisses her in the car, leading her to believe that she and Bob are now having an affair. Bob tells the truth to Linda in spite of Gail's warnings not to, and Linda is happy as she believes their fake affair will build Gail's confidence to the point that she's comfortable asking out another man. And they select Dr. Yap as that man when he shows interest in bringing the family to his ski lodge timeshare. Bob tries to keep up the charade long enough for Gail to fall for the dentist, but this fails as the dentist's approach to flirting is a method he learned from a pickup artist. Eventually, Bob starts to ski out of control, being chased by Gail, being chased by Dr. Yap, being chased by Tina, and Bob winds up crashing into a snowman created by Louise as she's been in a contest with Jean to see who gets to have a jawbreaker. The jawbreaker breaks one of Bob's teeth, requiring dental care to have it pulled, something Dr. Yap does without anesthetics as he believes Bob was trying to steal Gail away from him. In the end, Linda pretends to be obsessed with Yap, so Gail will try to steal him away, her plan working out after all. This is an episode about miscommunications and dysfunction in relationships that's made much more interesting by contrasting it to the way in which a past or contemporary sitcom would have handled the plot. Most shows would have had Bob kissing Gail as the instigator for the whole plot, and his increasingly desperate attempts to hide the affair getting him into trouble. But here Bob admits the truth to Linda as soon as he finds out himself, and the plot ends up playing off of the surprising acceptance for the action that Linda has. But Bob's honesty ends up getting punished, as he's accused of genuinely trying to seduce Gail by Linda due to a misunderstanding, something he ends up with a pulled tooth for. However, more honesty is what solves the issue, as Linda admits that she was merely acting out of passion after seeing her husband near another woman, and the characters who act more morally ambiguous are the ones who really suffer. Everything we've seen from the two characters implies that Dr. Yap and Gail are extremely unstable people who will no doubt end up making each other miserable, while Bob gets to return to a happy, functional relationship with kids who learn from his actions, Tina getting over her crush on the dentist when she sees him being unnecessarily cruel. Moody Foodie. Some of Bob's fellow restaurateurs warn him of the Moody Foodie, a critic who has been leaving bad reviews of restaurants that can often lead to them being outright shut down. He tries not to panic over the potential disguised critic until he notices a man in costume using his iconic blue handkerchief, and the whole family goes into a panic as they botch taking and then making his order. The ensuing review is negative, and it starts to drive business away, with Bob taking it especially personally. But when Tina suggests that he try to have a do-over on the review, Bob goes over to the man's house to force him to eat a burger. The critic refuses to eat it, though, so Bob ends up tying him to a chair, with the other restaurateurs coming in to harass the guy as well. Eventually, they wind up taking the mailman hostage as well when Bob finally realizes that he's gone too far, ultimately choosing to bribe the men to stay quiet, where it's revealed that he's never seen the movie Tin Cup because he read a bad review of it. In the end, Bob's Burgers survives by offering a promotion for half off any customer who brings in a negative review, and the Moody Foodie doesn't press charges after actually having Bob's do-over burger. Bob loves burgers. This is key to his character, that everything he's doing is all in the interest of his restaurant. It's where his family lives, it's where he's raising his kids, it's where he puts his passion into. So when a food critic insults his restaurant, he's not merely insulting Bob's food, but Bob's very essence, who he fundamentally is as a person. We've seen how little offense he takes to various things throughout the show up to this point. People will call Bob fat, they'll insult his sense of decor, he's even willing to have a tooth pulled without anesthetics or have an attack documentary made about him without holding much of a grudge. But to insult his restaurant comes with disproportionate retribution, because to most people, a restaurant is just a store, not a lifestyle. People will survive having a failed business venture and can move on with their lives. But Bob goes after a person with everything he has, completely ignoring the fact that tying a man to a chair and force-feeding him burgers is a bad idea, as there's something greater at stake in the conflict. But just to Bob, hence why the retribution seems disproportionate. Bad Tina. Tina is put in charge of welcoming the new girl, Tammy, to the school, with Tammy getting her into trouble, eventually sent to detention. When Tina returns from detention with a new vocabulary and tells her parents not to have a crap attack, Linda starts to worry that she's losing her daughter and puts new rules on her when babysitting the other kids. But Tammy invites herself over, as well as Jimmy Jr. and Zeke, who Tammy has developed a crush on, and the four get into Linda's margarita mix, pretending to be drunk afterwards. But when Tina has misgivings about this, Tammy steals her friend fiction from the bedroom and begins to use it as blackmail to make Tina do what she says. Worse in that Jean and Louise are also using her party the previous night to make Tina do their chores. But when Tina gets caught sneaking out with more margarita mix, her parents ground her, causing Tammy to decide to read Tina's friend fiction aloud the next day at school. When Linda learns about all of this, she convinces Tina not to be ashamed, and Tina vows to write a new story that she herself will read aloud. But Bob points out how bad this idea actually is, and they rush over to stop her. Jean and Louise manage to steal Tina's journal back before Tammy can read it out loud, but Tina reads hers anyway, becoming the laughingstock of the school until Tammy laugh farts in front of everyone, with the attention turning to her instead. Tina discovers the secret to fitting in during this episode, doing whatever anybody tells you to do with no regard for your personal wants or whether it's a good idea. If you do what people tell you, they'll enjoy spending time with you. Maybe you won't enjoy the time, but if you don't value yourself especially highly, then this is the sort of relationship that you'll be drawn to. And so Tina ends up being manipulated by Tammy, and with the same mindset, manipulated by her siblings as well, until she ultimately decides to take matters into her own hands in the most Tina way imaginable. Because that really is the best solution to her current woes. Part of what makes her situation with Tammy so bad is not the fact that she's being manipulated, but the fact that she's losing a part of herself in the process. So Tina stops being Tina and starts being Tammy 2.0. So to be aggressively Tina is the best way to get back to being herself. She says something stupid in front of the crowd while her father, currently obsessed with caking, shows up to embarrass her further, but embarrassing or not, no one can deny that she's her own woman instead of somebody else's. Beefsquatch. A daytime talk show, Get On Up with Chuck and Pam, hosts a segment for local chefs, with the Belchers sending in a tape that includes footage of Gene running around in a Sasquatch mask he acquired. They're brought on to the show with Gene steals with his Beefsquatch antics, eventually getting Bob a permanent segment alongside his son. Bob grows jealous of Beefsquatch's popularity, and eventually he starts to hire Louise to sabotage Gene, who is also using Louise to sabotage Bob. Their attacks against one another ramp up, much to the fear of Linda, who's heard about show business ruining families, and she tries to get them taken off the air, only to be thrown out alongside Tina, who was Bandwind Nathan, a boy who pretended to be interested in her so he could smell Pam's hair, disguised as her to sneak into the dressing rooms. When a network executive visits the studio to scout Beefsquatch for his own spin-off, Chuck encourages Bob and Jean to fight each other for the audience's entertainment, prompting Louise to throw a garbage can through the window so Linda can stop the show the only way she knows how, flashing the camera so the FCC finds the show into bankruptcy. Jean becomes obsessed with celebrity status in this episode, drawing the ire of his father in spite of the fact that Bob himself also wanted the same status. Their rivalry here is driven by both of them competing for attention, as they view one as stepping on the toes of the other. And yet the only reason either one got any break in the first place was due to the fact that they were working together. Bob never would have had his audition looked at if Beefsquatch wasn't running around in the background, and Jean's Beefsquatch act needed a straight man to play off of. The only thing that they really failed at doing was the fact that they never realized they played well off each other, the same way that Chuck and Pam recognized. Although even then this wouldn't have been an ideal symbiosis, as it was never Bob's dream to be famous, but for his burgers to be famous instead. Bob just wants a platform for his art form to be taken seriously. The antics of his son only distract from that without giving proper attention to the burgers. So much so that he's even willing to start placing strange ingredients inside just to harass Jean when he eats them for his act. This is also a relationship shown in Bob's success as a restaurateur. The Beefsquatch bit is bringing in customers, but he doesn't care about the success as they're not interested in the food, but the rubber mask. Season 3. As I've stated before, very little changes from season to season in Bob's Burgers. The staff remains very consistent with very few exceptions, and the overall point of the show, after being ironed out a bit early on, stays the same for several years of its run. Given this fact, I will likely not be doing seasonal introductions moving forward unless there's something unique about the upcoming episodes that needs to be pointed out. Even then, this will often be better suited to an individual episode retrospective. Earsy Rider. A group of bikers called the One-Eyed Snakes goes next door to Mort's to have the funeral for their leader, Horny Dave, crashing Bob's Burgers afterwards. Bob is hesitant to serve them but does it anyway, and their new leader, Critter, pays for the damage to his restaurant and afterwards gives them their insignia to place in their window as a sign of protection. Meanwhile, Louise walks through a staircase that a group of teenagers led by one, Logan, have taken over, and he retaliates by stealing her hat. Louise freaks out a bit over having her hat stolen, following Logan around and repeatedly trying to get it back before eventually telling his parents what he did. But when Logan says that he threw the hat away and Louise tracks it to an incinerator, she decides to get revenge by cashing in the favor the One-Eyed Snakes gave to the Belchers by having them cut off Logan's ears. Giving in to the threat, Logan reveals he still has the hat and returns it, but Logan's parents go to Bob's Burgers to complain about the character of the patrons and a fight breaks out, eventually resulting in Horny Dave's jacket being torn. The bikers prepare for a brawl until one of theirs, Mudflap, starts to have contractions and Logan's father delivers the baby in the restaurant. In the end, nobody's ears are cut off and Bob ends the episode with a speech about how it's better to be a good neighbor than it is to complain about bad ones. Logan is tired of being around kids, so he starts to chase them away from a staircase. Louise is tired of being told not to walk somewhere, so she taunts Logan, who steals her hat, so she has the bikers threaten him, so the parents try to close down the restaurant, so a gang of bikers threatens to kill them. Every character in this exchange is simply sick of other people acting rude to them, getting revenge against a perceived slight by escalating events while justifying their actions to themselves as a fair response, as they consider only their own pain and not the motivation of the other party. Bob points out that, in order to justifiably complain about the state of your neighborhood or town or the world, it helps if you yourself are actually on the high ground of the situation. If you're part of the problem, then you shouldn't be complaining about the problem. But very few people actually want to acknowledge if they're culpable for any of the issues that surround them, indirectly or not, and so they tend to view their complaining as part of the solution while actively alienating their neighbors and contributing to a less friendly, personable society. Bob worries about what might happen to the wharf if the bikers start hanging out around there, but rather than shutting them out, he serves them at the restaurant anyway, not because he wants to do it, but because he acknowledges that the world would be a better place if fewer people got turned away. Full bars. The kids decide to go trick-or-treating without Bob this year, leaving Bob and Linda free to go to Ted's costume party. They wander around for a while but don't get any good candy, mostly just leftover condiments from the various restaurants nearby. So the decision is made to go to King's Head Island, the rich neighborhood, where they start to get much better candy, including full-sized chocolate bars. But the kids are warned that if they stay out too late, they'll become victims of the Hell Hunt, where the teenagers roam around to harass the kids once their parents are too drunk to stop them. The Belcher kids manage to avoid being captured and prepare to take the ferry back, but Tina realizes that they owe the kids of the island for showing them where the best candy was, and they plot to free their fellow children by stealing a teenage girl's cell phone and texting the boys to leave the kids to skinny dip instead. While hot-saucing their underwear, the boys discover the ruse and chase the Belchers out into the street, where they're ambushed by the now liberated kids who want to get their revenge by chucking pee balloons at their tormentors. Meanwhile, Teddy's party turns into a murder mystery as he tries to deduce who stepped on his guinea pig, Frances, with Linda discovering that Bob squished her when trying to put on a fat suit. Bob confesses to the murder but points out that Teddy spray painting his pet couldn't have helped. In the end, everyone arrives back home and Linda shares the story of their night with the kids. A Halloween episode that plays with many of the conventions of horror by placing them into a more conventional populist lens. There's a murder mystery afoot with an exaggerated danger, as it's merely Teddy's paranoia that puts the partygoers at risk. One that's ultimately resolved by Bob himself admitting to it, but also pointing out that Teddy could not have been that close to Frances to have let her roam free and covered in spray paint. The kids also get into a scenario in which they have to evade a group of teenagers who are hunting children, going back into the dangerous area as they feel an obligation to the people from whom they extorted candy bars by pretending to be locals. It's also interesting to see people in both plots are going along with traditions and actions out of a performative sense of honor instead of the more logical approach. The teenagers are doing their hell hunt, not because they actually care about it, but because it's more or less what they're expected to do. When a girl starts talking about it, their leader flip-flops on whether he actually likes the hunt, and they're quick to drop it when they think they have something more interesting to do. Likewise, Teddy is aware that he's not a great caretaker for his guinea pig, but makes a showing out of his grief in order to make this less obvious. Bob fires the kids. Bob finds his old box of toys from when he was a child and realizes that he had a bad childhood due to constantly having to work in his father's restaurant. When he catches himself telling his own children to get back to work, he realizes he's denying them a childhood of their own, and so, in the interest of ensuring his kids don't wind up like him, Bob fires the kids. Now free from work, they don't know what to do with themselves, and wander about on their bikes until stumbling upon a blueberry farm, where they receive jobs. Meanwhile, Bob is struggling to find a replacement for his kids, willing to work for cheap, and ultimately settles on Mickey, the bank robber who took him hostage, to run the restaurant in their stead. But it turns out that Mickey, for all his enthusiasm, is actually just planning on tunneling underground to re-rob the bank, and Bob fires him. He tries to rehire his kids, but as they're already working, they refuse the offer. However, one of Tina's customers complains about the quality of his blueberries and leaves the box at the restaurant where Bob and Linda discover the fruit is actually a cover for marijuana. Mickey takes the Belchers to the farm to get their kids back, with a DEA agent following them there, busting in to take the couple running the farm into custody when everything goes back to normal. Bob realizes that his childhood wasn't miserable due to the fact that he had to work, but rather due to the fact that he had to work for a humorless man who refused to allow him to goof off or enjoy himself ever. His first misattribution is what he enforces on his children, though, kicking them out during the summer in an attempt to force them to have the happy childhood he didn't. But as soon as he does this, the kids assume it's a bluff, as they can't comprehend why their father wouldn't want them around, and neither can Bob himself. Since he wasn't close with his father, he doesn't know the type of happy relationship other kids might have with theirs. It never occurs to him that perhaps his kids actually want to hang out around the restaurant, and that is their version of fun. It's telling that the kids' first attempt at finding something else to do with their time is to go find a different couple to work for. And yet, because of their work being a necessity of their parents' restaurant, they don't actually have a proper relationship with what labor is supposed to look like, resulting in the kids selling drugs for an elderly couple of hippies. While this can mostly be attributed to their ages, it still reinforces the idea that the Belcher children work at the restaurant not because they're forced to, but because they want to. Mutiny on the Windbreaker. The Windbreaker comes into town and the captain, Captain Flarty, notices Bob. At first he offers the family a 10-day all-expenses cruise on the condition that Bob be his personal chef, but when Bob can't walk away from his obligations at the restaurant, he cuts the offer down to a single meal. But after this meal, Bob notices that they've left the harbor and are out at sea, with Bob being forced to work alongside the other chef Duval for the whole trip anyway. Louise gets her nails sharpened, Tina tries to get a massage, Linda gets a tan, and Jean falls in love with the ventriloquist's puppet who tries to seduce money out of him. But Bob refuses to be a prisoner, and when he's locked in the walk-in cooler, breaks out and tries to formulate a plan to escape by starting a mutiny. These plans are delayed as he tries to prevent Duval from serving expired oysters, ultimately getting caught and threatened with expulsion from the boat. But when the whole cruise gets sick and Duval feels guilty, they start a mutiny for real, and the boat is finally returned to the harbor. It's interesting how much more realistic Bob's Burgers is than so many other shows in this episode, not so much in the fact that an insane ship captain with a pet capybara is taking his entire crew hostage, but in the fact that the family cannot actually take a free vacation due to other obligations. So many TV show families seem to have the 1-hour work week. They only go to work when it's relevant for the plot. But here the work Bob does is a constant consideration in his mind, in the same way that it would be for anyone who does have to work for a living. Vacations are planned around work schedules. Outside activities only happen when there's a reason they can get attention. Nobody is able to drop everything to go on to something more entertaining for the audience. They've got to run the restaurant. So Bob's Burgers is able to get away with certain unorthodox plots without ever losing the audience's ability to relate. The Belchers, too, get to have exaggerated characteristics without losing the audience's ability to relate either. We don't relate to Jean's love affair with the puppet or Louise's super long nails, but these are things close enough to what the kind of mischief that a kid might get involved in that we can understand their motivations. So Bob getting captured due to his chef's code of refusing to let somebody serve spoiled food is actually the most absurd thing in an episode where being shanghaied is comparable to a luxury vacation. An indecent Thanksgiving proposal. Mr. Fishodor is trying to sleep with a retired sharpshooter/homewrecker, Shelby Schnabel, and he offers 5 months' rent in exchange for the Belchers pretending to be his family for one Thanksgiving dinner. Bob goes along with this in spite of Thanksgiving being his favorite holiday, as he still plans to sneak the Belcher traditions inside of the other holidays, so he might still spend time with his family. But Fishodor offers the kids tickets for good acting, and the promise that they can get a prize for having the most of them, resulting in the children getting hyper-competitive over showing off how much they love their pretend father, much to Bob's annoyance, as no one is spending time with him, so he drinks absinthe alone in the kitchen. Eventually Bob starts to hallucinate that the turkey, who he's named Lance, is talking to him, and falls asleep through his toast. After discovering this, he storms into the dining room to do his toast anyway, where he decides he doesn't want anyone else to have his turkey and runs off with the bird. Shelby starts to hunt him down with her old rifle in hand, eventually shooting Lance and causing Linda to break the illusion. Shelby rejects Fishodor as she only wants to sleep with a married man, and the Belcher family sits down to enjoy their bullet turkey. Bob loves Thanksgiving. It's his favorite holiday, even if this sentiment is not shared by his children. He gets so excited every year when he gets to cook the turkey and do the toast that naming the turkey and him talking to it like it's speaking back to him isn't even considered that strange of a behavior to exhibit. He also loves his family, tying into the amount that he loves Thanksgiving, as it's a traditionally family-oriented holiday. So when Mr. Fishodor offers him a few months' rent in exchange for missing out on a Thanksgiving with his family, he turns down the offer immediately, and then accepts it when that offer is extended to 5 months. Because as much as Bob wants to be sentimental in his love of his family members, he is occasionally forced to be pragmatic about his wishes, taking a side in the fight about what his children want, what he wants, and what actually makes sense to do. He's willing to sell his favorite holiday tradition to Fishodor on the assumption that he'll still get a little bit of the original hopes for the night. But as the night goes on and he gets more and more drunk, Bob eventually realizes that he's the only one who wanted to celebrate a traditional Thanksgiving holiday, and so he's the only person who really gave anything away. But far from taking any silver lining in his children getting a better life for very little, he instead cracks down on their lack of understanding what it is that they're giving up for a bit of rent. The Deepening. Mr. Fishodor is looking for a new attraction for the wharf and gets the idea from Bob to buy the animatronic shark from the movie The Deepening 3, which was filmed in the town decades ago. In spite of Teddy's arguments against the idea, the shark is loaded with diesel and set up in the middle of the park, chomping away at nearby guests with no regard for safety. Tina starts to fall for the shark as she believes it's just misunderstood, but Jean and Louise want some of its mechanical fin, and in their attempts to cut it off, the shark is let loose. As block captain, Bob is put in charge of putting a stop to it, and he calls a brainstorming meeting to come up with the various schemes to prevent it from going further down the street, all of which only make the shark more dangerous until eventually it's buried underground, where it burrows into Bob's basement. Bob goes down into the basement to confirm if it's dead, with Teddy going along after he reveals that he was once a minor actor on the set of the Deepening 3, and that the shark animatronic ruined his chances with the girl, making him turn to food for comfort. When entering the store, the shark bursts through the ground and eats Mort, trying to eat Teddy as well before Tina points out that they could destroy it by using the soft serve machine it's eating to overload it from the inside. The shark is finally stopped, Mort reveals he's okay, and Tina chooses her father over an animatronic killing machine. Bob's Burgers takes on Jaws, the entire episode being a parody of that movie beat for beat, with the differences being in the much more mundane execution of the gags. Fish Odor wants to keep the animatronic shark active during operating hours instead of keeping a beach open for the holiday weekend. Bob works alongside a man whose beef with the shark is that it made him spill a drink on a girl he was flirting with. And the finale involves an ice cream machine exploding instead of a harpoon welded to a rocket, and I might have the Lemon Demon version of Jaws in my head. But aside from the parody aspects of the episode, it does allow us to see characterization come out as a result of a stressful situation the cast is put into. Bob is the first person to volunteer to check on the shark after taking charge of the situation due to his responsibilities to his role as block captain. Jean and Louise are the ones who make the shark situation worse in their attempts to make some mischief, and Tina, of course, falls in love with an animatronic, fitting for her personality as the world's most confused teenager. Tina-Rannosaurus Wrecks. After picking up some napkins, Bob decides to let Tina drive the car in the almost empty parking lot, where she gets nervous and hits the only other car there. Bob convinces Tina to lie about the crash to their insurance adjuster, Chase, though Tina is a bad liar and comes up with an elaborate story instead of the simple one Bob planned to tell. Chase accepts their claim and offers to have Bob cater a barbecue he's hosting. But while Tina's put in charge of the grill, she sets fire to the house and the whole thing burns to the ground. Tina feels extremely guilty over this and eventually confesses the first lie to her family, so she and Bob set out to go to Chase's office to admit the truth. But Chase not only says that he knew they were lying in the first place, but that the house burning down was an intentional sabotage, and he blackmails the family into flooding their basement for yet another insurance scam they can all get in on. At first, they try to scare Chase out of the insurance fraud game by pretending to drown the kids, but when he doesn't believe it, Tina simply uses Jean's keyboard to record him admitting to the fraud, and they turn him in. While this is going on, Mort is chauffeuring the family around, upset at the amount of work it is until he notices a thank you package right before he was about to go on an angry rant. After Bob convinces Tina to lie about who was driving the car during the time of the incident, she starts to fear that the situation might spiral out of control, her immortal soul being at risk due to this singular fib. And as the episode progresses, this is exactly what comes to pass. Later on, she's culpable for burning down a residency and afterwards roped into committing more and more acts of insurance fraud at the insistence of a man who recognized their lie for a sign that he had found two people willing enough to go along with his schemes. Bob is at first willing to go along with Chase's schemes for insurance fraud, masterminding the first one and hesitantly accepting the second after it's already happened. And he's not so against the flooding plan as to try to shut it down, rather than to counter one of his own. Being outdone by a more experienced scam artist, Chase is voiced by Bob Odenkirk after all. It's Tina who recognizes the slippery slope they're going down, and thus, it's Tina who has to be the one to shut down the whole operation. Otherwise, she would never have been able to forgive herself for her passivity, the same passivity that caused her to crash the car in the first place. The unbearable likeness of Jean. Jean learns that a girl from his school, Courtney Wheeler, has a crush on him. Unfortunately, Courtney is the most annoying girl he knows, constantly chewing on her necklace and blaming all her habits on a heart disorder, and he wants nothing to do with her. But when her friends pressure Jean to accept her confession, he ends up going through with it. Louise and Tina try to explain the situation to Bob, who at first doesn't understand it, but later, after spending a few minutes in the car with the girl, completely agrees that Jean should break up. But Jean struggles to actually do this, made worse when he meets her father, Doug, who writes commercial jingles and has a house full of musical equipment. Jean continues to date Courtney in order to get closer to Doug, in spite of how obnoxious she is, until her birthday party, where Jean intends to perform a jingle of his own to impress Doug. But when Courtney tries to sing over his song, he snaps and tells her that he finds her annoying, which gives Courtney a heart attack. Jean visits her in the hospital and tries to break up with her for real, giving her another heart attack that kills her, until Courtney, her family, and the doctor reveal that it was just a trick to get back at him. In the B-plot, Linda tries to lose weight by only eating the skins of things, only to snap out of her weight loss obsession when a pervy old man compliments her at the doctor's office. Jean is told that the longer he waits to break up with Courtney, the harder it will eventually be to do so, and it's not something that's easy in the first place. But this is advice that applies more so to relationships in which both parties have some sort of fondness or dependence on one another. When you spend so much time around another person, you find it harder to live without them in your life due to the fact that they are slowly becoming more and more normal, and thus you start to fear the sudden change in lifestyle even if you feel no love towards that person. But Jean and Courtney never actually felt that love or dependence throughout the episode. Jean barely tolerated her and only stuck around because his sisters exaggerated a worst-case scenario. At least in the first half of the episode. Once Jean discovers that Courtney's father is working his dream job, he starts to invest his dreams into his future with the girl, no longer forcing himself to date her out of momentum, but because he thinks he can get a jingle record deal. It makes the situation more complex when Courtney is no longer the bad guy for pressuring Jean, but both parties behaving terribly for taking advantage of one another, instead of relying on actual feelings between the two. Of course, in an ironic twist, this actually makes the real breakup, not the shouting match at the party, much easier to go through with, so much so that Courtney is even ready for it before it happens. God rest ye merry Gentle-Mannequins. While telling his kids that he can't afford any of their Christmas present demands, Bob discovers that he's inherited a storage unit from a distant uncle. When they check out the inheritance, the family meets Chet, a homeless man who used to work for that uncle by doing displays in his windows. So he doesn't have to take over the lease, Bob lets Chet stay in the family's basement until the end of Christmas, and Chet repays him by putting on elaborate Christmas displays in the restaurant's window, where Chet himself poses as one of the mannequins. These displays continue on over the days leading up to Christmas, driving a lot of business to the store. But before Christmas Day comes, Chet is spending time with the family when he mentioned his lost love, Nadine. As it turns out, Nadine is a mannequin who used to be part of the displays with Chet, who himself used to be a mannequin. And the two fell in love until the mall was built, closing the store and separating the couple. Bob is skeptical of the story as he believes that Chet is just a crazy homeless guy, but when he says as such, Chet gets upset and creates a gruesome display for Christmas Day. So the family sets out to find Nadine and cheer up their guest, eventually tracking her down to a sex shop where they steal the womannequin, cheering up Chet enough that he puts on a proper display. At least until he starts to make out with Nadine, making the excited onlookers leave in disgust. Bob's Burgers does Christmas, their version of a holiday spirit being the type of guy who appears in their life, enriches the season, and then gets helped out in some selfless deed by the kids as they all learn the true meaning of Christmas is to unite lost lovers, a man and his mannequin. The usual Christmas miracle-esque story has some small degree of magical realism involved, an ambiguous situation where the audience never knows whether the events were really supernatural or if there was a logical explanation after all. Not that that was ever the concern when the holidays are involved. Despite the absurdity of some of the set dressing, this is still a very straightly played Christmas story between the kids giving up their gifts for a less tangible reward and a Scrooge who refuses to accept the magic of the situation. But that set dressing is what allows each character to play its part in their usual roles. The kids ask for far too much, except Tina, and so the things they give away are objects they realistically never had. They were merely giving away the idea of the gifts. And of course, Bob can be the designated Scrooge without being unlikable, as his ghost of Christmas past is just a dude living in a storage shed who thinks he's a store mannequin. Mother-daughter laser razor. Linda tries to connect with her kids, only for Louise to be more interested in spending time with Bob than with her. She tries a few things to get closer to her daughter, following the advice of the Phenomamom, a motherhood blogger, and ultimately decides to take Louise to a mother-daughter healing seminar. Louise wants nothing to do with this event, so Linda has to bribe her with money to go through with the various events that the Phenomamom, a man named Dakota, puts them through. But while they're there, Linda gets competitive against Cynthia, Logan's mother, over who will win a Most Valuable Mom sash, resulting in Louise and Logan getting upset with the competition and locked in the Uter room, where they have to watch Freaky Friday on loop. They plot to escape the room by faking stomach aches, locking the mothers away while they go play laser tag next door. Once the moms break out, Linda tries to confront her daughter only to instead get caught up in the game of laser tag, where she eventually makes her peace with Louise to team up against Dakota instead. Meanwhile, Tina is worried about her leg hair, and failing to get Linda's attention enough to shave it, asks Bob to go with her to get it waxed, Bob also getting his legs waxed, as Tina was too nervous to do it alone. But after doing this, she feels bad about killing her leg hair due to peer pressure, and vows not to give in to pressure again in the future. Louise's position as one of the boys in this episode starts to cause Linda some jealousy, as she starts to feel like a failure as a mother due to her child not wanting to share the affection. This is made worse by the fact that her obvious favorite parent doesn't really do anything that causes the attention to build up around him either. So with Bob effortlessly being Louise's favorite and Linda's efforts getting her no closer to that status, she starts to fear that her very best efforts can't compare to Bob's indifference, that no effort of hers can reach what Bob and Louise have, and it's a personal failure. And yet it's not the right message for her to have taken from the experience. Linda's best efforts are merely the best efforts that would have impressed herself. No matter the effort she makes in this direction, she'll never impress Louise, as she's not actually finding middle ground between the two. Ironically, it's her acceptance of not being able to relate to Louise that finally lets her find this ideal situation. She gives up and begins to open fire inside of the laser tag arena, at last letting Louise know that she's not driving a wedge between the two any longer. Nude Beach. Hugo makes Bob go to a hand-washing seminar, placing a large sign outside his restaurant until he completes it before leaving to judge a nude beach. But when Linda visits the beach later out of curiosity, she discovers that Hugo has given up on the health inspecting game to become a full-time nudist instead. His replacement is Tommy Gironda, a wannabe rock star who immediately cozies up to Bob by wiping his health inspector slate clean. But he does this in exchange for being allowed to perform his music in Bob's restaurant, music that's profane and drives away customers. Bob tells Tommy that his music is bad, so Tommy plants rat feces around the restaurant to shut it down. Realizing that they need Hugo back, Bob goes to the beach to try to convince him to return, only for Hugo to declare that he'll only go back if Bob beats him in a nude cathalon, a series of sporting events. Meanwhile, the Belcher children create an overlook to spy on the beach, selling tickets to the other kids to watch naked old people. But they're horrified when they see their own father at the beach, only to turn around to cheer him on when they see the competition going on. Bob ends up losing to Hugo, though the event reminds Hugo of how good it feels to beat Bob at stuff, so he returns to being a health inspector, reopening Bob's Burger so he can shut it down on his own terms. As regular of an antagonist as Hugo has become, he's also become a fitting villain for the Belcher family insofar as the show ceases to work without him. He has a hatred for Bob and wants his restaurant shut down, which is somehow supposed to drive Linda back to him. And if he gets replaced by somebody else, so much of the show stops working insofar as the relationship between Bob and his health inspector. To replace him with someone else would not fit the show Bob's Burgers, but to replace him with a similarly interesting character would not fit the in-universe version of Bob's Burgers. It's worth mentioning that Hugo's very first visit to the restaurant in the series began with him giving a series of legitimate criticisms of the store, all things he wrote down before ever finding out about Linda living with the guy. So Hugo is an unfair health inspector, but he's unfair in a way that's fair not for the characters in the show, but the format of the show itself. He's antagonistic without being too evil, just enough to be interesting without being frustrating, and the fact that he's willing to find happiness and then throw it away all in the interest of continuing to make Bob miserable is proof of the fact that Hugo knows what's interesting for him as well. Broadcast Wagstaff School News. Tina auditions for the local news but fails to make it because of their total lack of charisma and a bit of sabotage from Tammy. She ends up being the staff intern, mostly getting juice for the other news crew, while her suggestions to run stories on anything other than what Mr. Grant considers important, which is generally just gossip, are ignored. But when Tina talks with the janitor and discovers that someone has been tracking feces into the school, she teams up with Louise to discover the culprit, eventually deducing the deuce is man-made. Tina's legitimate news starts to overshadow the news broadcast made by Wagstaff, so Tammy and Mr. Grant plan to sabotage their competition by framing Tina as the butler. She's brought to the principal's office while the rest of the school is at an anti-smoking seminar, only to realize that the mad pooper is likely going to strike again at this event. Meanwhile, Gene realizes that he takes after Bob physically and decides to accept his future by having Louise give him a makeover to look like Bob. He then proceeds to do a Bob impression for the next few days that annoys Bob but impresses everyone else with its accuracy. He maintains the impression until the mad pooper is about to strike, throwing out his old man personality to watch someone poop. In the end, Tina is able to expose the mad pooper as Zeke, and her reputation is saved, with Tina getting her own news segment. Tina takes an objective approach to journalism, trying to find stories that are informative and important to tell, compared with the rest of the newsroom following the modern media mentality of telling people what they want to hear. This approach is the kind meant not for the benefit of the audience, but the shareholders profiting off of that audience. More people are willing to watch the trivial matters on the first channel until Tina is able to tantalize the student body not with sensationalism, but genuine intrigue. So for a brief moment, drama and relationships take a backseat to actual news, purely because that actual news happened to be the bigger story at the moment. Recognizing this, the Wagstaff student news attempts to sabotage both Tina and the story by combining them into one, accusing her not just of being the mad pooper, but, worse, being a bad reporter. But Tina still has her ideals. She doesn't simply try to deny the lie, but to find the truth as well, maintaining the informed status of the class as priority number one. This is what allows her to come out on top in the end, both in terms of her show's popularity, but her journalistic integrity as well. It's harder to do, but legitimate news can win out as long as they're going out of their way to find something worth reporting on, instead of making things up to patch up a slow news day. My Fuzzy Valentine. Bob gives Linda a heart-shaped pancake for Valentine's Day, a gift she's less than enthusiastic about. On the way to school, the kids point out that Bob has a history of bad gifts, so they try to get him to remember his most romantic moment, and he recalls a date with Linda where they wound up at a bar with a love tester. So the kids help Bob track down this love tester, mostly so they can get out of school, and they find that it's been sold to one of the restaurants Hugo is inspecting later that day. They tail him for a while until Ron eventually gives them the schedule, where Bob goes down the list before discovering the machine at the final restaurant, where Hugo has already purchased it to stop Bob from giving it to Linda. Bob ends up having to overpay for the device, only to remember that the romantic date he remembered wasn't actually with Linda but a different woman instead. Meanwhile, Linda has been running a Valentine speed dating service out of Bob's Burgers, though it's commandeered by Sergeant Bosco when he starts challenging Linda's games, convincing the others to show off their worst traits instead of their best. Eventually, Linda takes the officer's gun, almost getting arrested until Bob and the kids return, where he explains where they were. Louise calls in a faked suspect that draws the attention away from Linda, and the family makes up, as Linda actually thought that Bob's trip was romantic after all. Bob is not the type of man to do a big romantic gesture, as his version of love is not to do a few big things, but hundreds and hundreds of small ones. So his version of romance reflects this. He does something small for Valentine's Day because that's just what he's used to. If he constantly reaffirms to Linda that he loves her, then there's no reason to do that exact thing once a year, except more expensive and less sincere. It's to the point where the biggest romantic thing he's ever done was an accident, and this is what he hopes to achieve. But indicative of his romantic relationship with Linda, this memory was not a memory of her, but another woman instead, and yet this ends up making him come out looking better rather than worse. The fact that Bob attempts to remember something romantic and automatically assumes that Linda was involved shows his outlook on their entire relationship. Another thing that contextualizes Linda's view of the relationship is how she treats the speed dating seminar. She feuds against Bosco over whether relationships ought to be defined by the best traits of the couple or the worst, and she takes the side of positivity. Bosco takes the side of people tolerating one another as the main source of success in a relationship, and yet he's separated from his wife and miserable in the relationship. So Linda disagrees with a miserable man on how to be happy, making her opinion appear much more valid. Lindapendant Woman. While trying to figure out which services they can bounce checks on this week, Linda suggests that she get a part-time job, ultimately finding one at Fresh Feed, a nearby grocery store. Bob struggles to run the restaurant without all the little things that Linda does, nor can he balance the budget his own way. But Linda refuses to come back as her efforts at her new job are more appreciated, as she gets promoted to shift manager after her first week. But while she's working there, all the other employees start to come up with excuses to take time off, with Linda taking over their jobs one by one, until eventually she's the only employee left in the store. She tries to have the kids take over some of the other jobs, but this doesn't fix anything, and eventually, Bob comes over to try to ask Linda to return once the power gets shut off. He confesses that he would rather be broke together than getting along separately, and Linda feels the same way. So they both return to the restaurant, leaving Fresh Feed in chaos. In the B-plot, Tina is hanging out behind the milk when she meets a boy with a bandaged hand, falls in love, and tries to meet up with him again, finally finding him in the chaos as she gives him her phone number while stuck on the shelf. Linda works alongside her husband in order to keep the family afloat financially, but she doesn't get much out of it other than a bit of time with Bob, who recognizes her efforts as being something done out of necessity rather than passion. But because Linda is a passionate woman, this is not enough for her. She wants to put a lot into a job and get a lot out, and as usual assumes that others would share that sentiment. But they don't. The other Fresh Feed employees treat the grocery store like a job and nothing more, so when Linda shows a bit of passion, they take advantage of her and have her do the work instead of them. Linda is eager to do this at first, realizing that it gives her a chance to shine, but when the store falls into chaos, she learns the value of half-assing it. Sometimes a realistically motivated leader is what it takes to ensure they're delegating work down instead of taking on all the responsibility themselves. Bob too realizes that he had been forcing his ideology onto the rest of his family. He assumes that everybody working for him is doing so because they have to, much in the same way that he views some of the details as obligations, otherwise he would be doing them himself. So the episode's plots come down to two miscommunications about workplace mentality. Bob needs to accept the fact that Linda wants people to love her work as much as she does, and Linda realizes that Bob does not default to that form of thinking. OT, the outside toilet. Gene fails a home ec assignment by dropping his flower baby 3 times, and while sulking about it, stumbles across a fancy toilet in the woods. Gene and the toilet quickly become friends, with the toilet telling jokes while Gene feeds it water. But when he brings his siblings over to see the toilet, he learns that it's low on battery and has to be charged. They return to the restaurant to find extension cords, where they meet a man who introduces himself as Max Flush, the man who lost the toilet and is searching for it once again. They make a plan to sneak out around Max and return to their toilet, lifting him with their bikes before ultimately stumbling into the road where Gene and the toilet are discovered. Meanwhile, Bob borrows a suit from Mort that was left there with a body and wears it to contest a traffic ticket, then realizes that the suit makes people respect him. So he takes Linda on a date where the two get so many free drinks that they forget to eat anything and have to take a taxi home, the same taxi that discovers Gene. The family rushes to a coffee shop to charge their toilet, only for Max to trap them, until he's arrested as the toilet was originally stolen. As Gene is saying his goodbyes, a man nearby notices the familiarity with Bob's suit and discovers that it was originally his father's, and everything goes back to normal. Gene struggles to take care of a flower baby, but gets the chance to make things right by taking care of a talking toilet. As the toilet can mostly manage itself at first, this provides the boost to his confidence that he was looking for, as Gene starts to become attached to his intelligent new friend. When Max Flush, actually Tim Jones, tries to take the toilet away, Gene isn't merely losing a friend, but a sentiency that he's putting some of his self-worth into. His chance at a redemption is sullied by his failure to protect the toilet until the very end, when the porcelain seat is finally given to its rightful owner, a loss of this companionship, but a loss that happens on his own terms, and thus one that's acceptable. Of course, this episode is really an extended reference to E.T., down to many of the shots and plot beats. As usual, the parody is given a more absurd tone, as instead of protecting an alien who's misunderstood, Gene is taking care of a talking toilet. But the character beats remain the same as Gene and the kids start to view themselves as the only ones who know what's right for the seat, until it can return home. And this tracks too. While Gene has put his self-worth into the toilet, metaphorically but not that metaphorically, the others just think that a talking toilet is kinda cool. Topsy. Louise gets a substitute science teacher, Mr. Dinkler, who is obsessed with Thomas Edison. When Louise tries to resubmit last year's volcano to the science fair, he shoots down the idea and tells her to do a project about Edison instead. While researching, the librarian suggests that she looks up Topsy the elephant, and she learns that Edison once electrocuted an elephant for spectacle. So Louise plans to do a mock execution for her project, recruiting Jean to make the music and play Edison, while Tina plays Topsy. The project grows in scope, recruiting Mr. Fishodor and Gale to sing the music, while Teddy sets up a Van der Graaf generator to make the electricity. But Mr. Dinkler discovers Louise's plan to sully the name of his idol, and he sends her to the principal's office. Without Louise, Tina and Jean are put on the spot to perform their song Electric Love anyway, with the performance ending when Louise sneaks out and gets Teddy to turn on the machine, where Tina is seemingly electrocuted. But this was actually just her putting on a convincing performance after having a vision of the original Topsy. In the end, the winning science fair project turns out to be a Spice Something, one of the projects that Bob and Linda made to compete with one another. At first, Mr. Dinkler takes a pretty logical approach to teaching the science fair, trying to prevent students from submitting a generic project with very little thought put into it, in favor of being unique. Right up until the point where he eschews this logic in favor of blind support for his idol, so blind that he even goes out of his way to justify some of the man's actions when they're placed into a negative light. His obsession is viewed as a thoroughly negative trait, even through the point of the episode where it starts to rub off onto Louise. She becomes as obsessed with discrediting Edison as Dinkler does at supporting the guy, and it's not until Tina is nearly killed that the true version of this argument is revealed. There was no right or wrong side in the argument insofar as whether the man's behavior was acceptable, because both parties took extreme actions to support their role. In the end, neither Louise nor Dinkler actually cares whether or not Edison's behavior was ethical. They're simply trying to prove a point about their hero and making themselves look bad in the process. The language of one's ideology often takes a back seat to the way in which this ideology is enforced, with the only good people in the episode being those who cared more about the message than being correct, like Tina and Jean. Two for Tina. Tina asks Jimmy Jr. to the dance and gets a maybe from him. Later on, she stumbles upon Josh, the boy from the milk aisle in Lindapendant Woman, and learns that he's a dancer at the performing arts school. He asks her to a dance at his school, and she accepts, deciding to go with the boy who said yes instead of the boy who said maybe. But when Jimmy Jr. learns that Tina already has a date, he gets jealous and recruits the help of Jean and Louise to win her back. These attempts all fail until he goes to the performing arts school himself to win back Tina by challenging Josh to a dance-off. But Tina, not wanting anyone to get hurt, tries to date both boys simultaneously, only for them to be weirded out by this where they both decide not to date Tina, but to keep dancing with each other instead. Meanwhile, Bob and Linda are chaperoning the Wagstaff dance despite Tina not going to it, with Linda egging on Bob after finding out that he didn't go to his dances because a girl he had asked changed her mind at the last minute. Linda proceeds to get upset when Bob notices a more attractive teacher than her and runs off to the bathroom, only to reveal that she was merely trying to give him an authentic middle school experience. In the end, the couple is thrown out after getting too drunk on the schnapps that Linda snuck in. Tina, like most teenagers, has never had a proper romantic relationship with any of her peers. And then when she's able to get two at the same time, it's worth pointing out that neither of these relationships is exactly proper, but also worth mentioning that there really is no such thing. Whether you met someone in the milk aisle, or fell for them in a warehouse set to be demolished, or you won them over while dressed as a horse, the idea of a standard relationship is one of those things that people learn about through cultural osmosis, despite the fact that they never really happen. Just as every person is weird in some way, every relationship between two people is weird in some way as well. But there are some things that are consistent between relationships no matter how bizarre the circumstances surrounding them are. Tina is destined to get into trouble, much in the same way that Bob was harmed by a girl in his past, leading him on as well. No matter the circumstances, basic respect for your partner is something that is going to be consistent. So Tina was destined to lose her man as soon as she encouraged him to get involved in a dance-off. That sort of blasé attitude towards pitting the two against one another shows a lack of respect for the men as individuals. It snakes a village. While the restaurant is being fumigated, the Belchers go to Florida to visit Al and Gloria at their retirement community. The kids are excited to go to the pool there until learning it's been drained, so they find an old woman, Helen Kellerman, who is playing the harmonica while grieving her dead dog. She offers them $100 to find video evidence of the python that ate the dog, which Louise eagerly takes, recruiting Tina to go with her as Jean is too afraid of snakes. But when night falls and they get lost, Jean winds up chasing them down in a golf cart, finding the dog alive and well as they escape. Meanwhile, Bob and Linda find out that the retirement community is actually a community of elderly swingers, and that Gloria and Al are going to be kicked out for not participating in the community events. When Linda offers to let her parents stay with them, Bob sets out to ensure that it doesn't come to that, solving their lack of a sex life by convincing Gloria to wear headphones so Al's balloon popping fetish doesn't spook her. In the end, Linda's parents are able to salvage their romance, keep their house, and the Belchers vow to never visit Florida again. Bob dislikes his relatives enough to the point that he's willing to do a selfless act for a selfish reason to keep them away. He has a thoroughly uncomfortable conversation with Al about the old man's fetish for popping balloons, and brings this information to a woman he wants to avoid explicitly to keep them both away. Bob manages to save the sex lives of Linda's parents, and this was an issue that came up in the first place due to a selfless act. Al knows about Gloria's fear of sudden loud noises, and out of respect, holds back a desire of his from her in order to prevent potentially upsetting her. So Al almost gets them evicted to keep his wife happy, while Bob saves their marriage to keep them out of his life. Likewise, Louise sets out to rescue a lost puppy, or at least to provide some closure to the dog's owner, all in the interest of getting some money. Gene refuses to go along with this adventure, not as he finds it to be a waste of time or exploitative, but because he's afraid of snakes. This is a phobia he overcomes not because he loves his sisters, but because he doesn't want to be an only child himself. The kindest actions here are all done for selfish reasons, whereas others end up inflicting harm in the interest of avoiding it. Family Fracas. While walking to the movies after their car breaks down, the Belcher family is invited to the filming of a TV game show called Family Fracas, which is hosted by Chuck Charles, the TV host who lost his job during the events of Beefsquatch. They're brought on the air when another family cancels and ultimately win the show, though they don't get the minivan they were hoping for. Over the next several tapings, the Belcher family wins again and again, with Bob rubbing his victories in Jimmy Pesto's face repeatedly. Eventually, Jimmy goes on the show himself, with the vindictive Chuck assisting them by helping the family to cheat. Bob loses the game, and his pants, and Jimmy Pesto starts to brag, but when reviewing the footage, Bob starts to believe that the show was rigged, and goes on to Pam's Court, another show hosted by the other half of the duo from before, in order to make his case. When he asks for evidence of the cheating to be shown, Harry, the executive in charge, simply destroys the tape so a person working for him doesn't get exposed, and the Belchers lose once again. In the end, Bob sees the Pesto's van broken down and tries to rub it in, but his family convinces him to help change the tire. Bob wants justice in this episode, not merely looking for justice from Pam's court in regards to the rigged game show, but looking for justice from his financial situation early on. His car breaks down, leaving the family without any reliable form of transportation, despite the fact that he himself did very little to justify this. So when they get the opportunity to win a replacement vehicle on the game show, it's viewed as a way to wrap up the story in a way that's narratively satisfying. The underdog who needs the prize is the one who gets it over the loud-mouthed braggart and the corrupt TV show host. But this kind of justice is a narrative concept, not a natural law of the universe. It's something TV show writers include in their stories to please the audience. The later type of justice is a human concept as well, something governments tell their citizens in order to keep them assuaged. In both cases, it's something recognized as a positive trait. Justice is something needed for both a polite society as well as a good story, and is likewise something that people assume will exist in both of these scenarios, to the point that they feel upset if it's not present. But Bob, although a character in a story, is searching for justice in the wrong place, trying to get a fair trial from a TV show run by the people who benefited if the family ends up worse off. And at the end of the episode, he does something else that's not just. He helps out Jimmy Pesto with his broken down tire. It would be justice to leave him stranded there, but it would not be the right thing to do. The kids run the restaurant. While preparing for the lunch rush, Bob is distracted by his kids and accidentally cuts his finger crotch open. As he's hemophiliac, Bob is rushed to the hospital and the restaurant is shut down for the afternoon, with Tina babysitting her siblings. But Louise and Jean insist on opening anyway, and after failing to run the restaurant normally, decide instead to open a casino out of the basement. This casino, the Meat Grinder, has Jean running a girls' group that falls apart when they realize they never practiced, with Jean stepping in to perform himself, Tina serving drinks as the eye candy, and Louise managing the money. But when Mr. Fischoeder discovers the casino and starts to place huge bets, they quickly run dry as the guy wins big at the rock-paper-scissors table. Meanwhile, Bob and Linda are at the crowded hospital where their doctor reveals that Bob is his first patient, and that he has to look up a video on how to perform stitches. The stitching fails and they have to return to the hospital to get a nurse to do it, but eventually Bob and Linda are able to make it home, just in time to discover that they owe Fischoeder $5,000. Louise comes up with one last scheme, to play him double or nothing using Bob's injured hand, assuming Fischoeder will think that he can't throw scissors with the stitches, and then they manage to break even. With Bob incapacitated, the kids are expected to remain away from the restaurant, not to open it as he doesn't trust them to manage the front competently without him present. After all, he only cut open his hand because the kids were distracting him and the others in the first place. This fear is well founded as they immediately give up on the restaurant to run an underground casino instead, and yet, this casino is actually surprisingly well managed considering it's being run out of the basement by preteens. Louise is able to gather a large crowd and manages to keep them more or less in line, with Tina showing off her desire to be a gal, and Jean getting a chance to put together the girls group he's suddenly always wanted to have. So if anything, the thing that Bob has to fear is not that his kids can't run the restaurant, but that they might run it far too well and simply manage it in the wrong direction. Bob is eager for the simple sort of lifestyle that he has, while the kids are far more ambitious, with this ambition being the scarier thing than a sheer lack of competence. Because, as ambitious as the Belcher children are, these ideas aren't tempered by life experience and are therefore prone to be exploited by a bigger fish, or Fischoeder. Boys for now. Jean goes to a tablescaping contest with Bob and Linda, while Gail takes Tina and Louise to a Boys for Now concert. Though when she pepper sprays her cat and has to go to the vet, the girls end up with no plans. But seeing how distraught Tina is, Louise decides to take her to the concert anyway, hitching a ride from Zeke and Leslie. But while hate watching the concert, Louise sees Boo Boo of the band and becomes obsessed with him, wanting to learn more about the guy and eventually confessing that she wants to slap his face. So with Zeke's help, they sneak onto the tour bus and hide in a laundry hamper, bursting out once the bus leaves, and they see that Boo Boo has to sit in a booster seat. Louise is able to slap her crush, getting kicked out afterwards, where they're driven home by Gail, having a conversation about how bad it feels to have feelings for a boy. Meanwhile, Jean manages to impress with his magic-themed tablescape, with even Bob getting into the event after another parent tries to trash-talk their setup. But when Jean learns that he was expected to make a second scape for the contest, he panics and cobbles something together out of whatever Linda had in her purse. His feminine hygiene-themed table doesn't impress, but Jean is still happy to have taken home 4th place. As I've said before, Louise considers herself to be one of the boys, never interested in girly things and preferring the company of her father over her mother or other women. But part of this can be attributed to her age. She's still too young to have taken a notice in boys and the like, but this is not something that you can maintain forever. It's an inevitability, due to the passage of time, that she would eventually become as curious as anyone that age, possibly more so considering her shared DNA with Tina. So as Louise begins to develop feelings for a boy, she starts to confront not only these feelings, but the fact that she's no longer the child she once was. These feelings become compounded by the fact that she started the episode viewing boy bands in general as stupid, the same way she views so many other girly things in life. So it's not just about having a crush, but dealing with the fact that she's starting to become a person she doesn't recognize, and thus, she's going to hate becoming older. But while she hates the idea of puberty, she doesn't hate her sister, Tina. The Belchers actually get along with one another remarkably well, so instead of Louise becoming something she hates, she can retextualize puberty as becoming more like her sister. Carpe Museum. Wagstaff goes to the local museum with Bob volunteering as a chaperone, the role Linda usually plays. But while watching the restaurant, Linda starts to miss her old responsibilities and rushes over to the museum to take over, only to be caught up in the strike nearby until her semi-profane chanting gets the museum employees to chase her out. Louise is excited to see the Amazon exhibit and sneaks away from the group alongside her assigned buddy, regular-sized Rudy, forcing Bob to chase them down. But when Louise accuses Bob of being a buzzkill, he decides to sneak higher up in the exhibit, only for the trio to get trapped as Rudy needs his inhaler. So Bob ziplines down from the tree and saves the day after hearing Louise accidentally admit that she looks up to her father. Gene is paired with Zeke, who has a list his cousin made of all the boobs in the museum, though Gene is more interested in the foreign sands exhibit. And Tina is partnered with Henry, both of whom assume the other is the biggest dork in school and tries to teach the other one to be cooler, only to finally admit that they're both dorks, leading to a chain reaction of the rest of the school chiming in to say what they're a dork about. The Belchers go to a museum where they become split up by the field trip, with each member of the cast getting a chance to stand on their own, rather than having their plot affected by one of the others. Linda gets involved with a group of striking museum workers as she can't stand to see their half-hearted chanting. As they start to catch more and more of her contagious energy, their chanting improves, until the point where she starts to create a feedback loop of making weirder and weirder chants before being driven off. Gene finds someone who's more obsessive over something than he is, his hunt to find the perfect sand taking a backseat to Zeke's boob hunt, with the latter being more organized and becoming the main project. Louise tries to sneak off from the group, getting into trouble as she requires Bob to come over and not simply rescue her, but to convince her that she needs rescuing, something she doesn't realize until they're trapped high up with an asthmatic regular-sized Rudy. And finally, Tina meets a person who puts her perspective of herself into, well, perspective. She meets Henry, a guy who's just as dorky as herself, but totally unaware of this fact. And his lack of awareness forces her to confront her own awareness before ultimately concluding that it doesn't really matter if you're a dork as long as you're honest with yourself about it. The Unnatural. Gene is excited to start a baseball season until it's time to actually play the game, where he winds up disappointing his team because he's afraid of the ball. Linda tries to encourage Bob to teach him to play ball, only for their attempt to fail, so Linda instead finds a baseball training camp nearby, led by the pickup artist from last season's Dr. Yap. Unable to come up with the money for the camp, Linda sells Bob's new espresso machine to pay the deuce of diamonds. But not before Tina becomes addicted to coffee, running her mouth constantly until the sale of the machine causes her to go through withdrawal. Bob, hoping to get his money back, rushes to the phony baseball camp where the kids are playing without balls while the deuce narrates the hits they're making. But the Belchers find an empty field, as the instructor has taken them to his motel to threaten the manager there after he failed to pay. Bob arrives at the site of the kids failing to break a vending machine with bats and asks for his money back on the convoluted condition that he receives it if Gene is unable to hit a fair pitch in the game they put on nearby. But in spite of his cheers against his son, Gene manages a fly ball and the deuce runs away with the money. Gene begins this episode loving baseball and ends the episode loving baseball, the only obstacle to his enjoyment of the sport being the brief moment where he actually has to play it. At first, Gene is more than eager to hang out in the dugout with the other boys as he makes jokes while drawing on his face. But when the competitive spirit comes his way, he suddenly becomes very self-conscious about his lack of ability, as it's costing his team the very thing they came for. Ironically enough, the very thing he was lacking was what he got out of the training camp, and the episode even points out how Con Man is short for Confidence Man, and that all Gene really needed was confidence. And this is partially what caused Bob to be so opposed to the training camp in the first place. He was hoping to get Gene some baseball skills as a way to get confidence, instead of having the confidence training outright. The other reason Bob was opposed to the camp was the fact that he lost his espresso machine, a symptom of the fact that Linda went behind his back. And while it's completely reasonable that Gene's next excursion into the sport will probably result in another failure, he can still maintain the positive attitude that children's team sports leagues are supposed to instill in the first place, at least for the time being. Season 4. As I've mentioned before, Bob's Burgers was a show that managed to keep things realistic due to the fact that it kept a lens on the aspects of life that were the most relatable. But as of the next few seasons, Bob's Burgers starts to take on a less grounded tone. It's still by far the most realistic cartoon on the air in the vein of King of the Hill before it, but some of that immediate humanism is less present than it was before. A river runs through Bob. The whole family goes camping in order to make up for Tina missing a Thunder Girls camping trip. Bob is excited to show off his camping skills, planning on foraging and hunting all the food for the trip. But the rest of the family simply borrows some food from a nearby couple who reveal themselves to be survivalists. Later on, Bob and Linda decide to try skinny dipping in a nearby warm spring, but get washed away by the currents, winding up far downstream. They attempt to walk back to camp to reunite with the kids, but only get even more lost when they follow Bob's directions. After saving him from a pack of squirrels, Linda takes charge and leads them back to camp, only to discover the kids are missing. They borrowed some snacks and inner tubes from the survivalists and went downstream to find their family, eventually coming across a group of Thunder Girls where Tina renounced her membership as none of their guidance prepared her for living in the woods. Linda's guidance is able to get the couple back to camp, where they're lured into the camper of the survivalists, who invite them to a revenge orgy that they try to sneak out of, only to see the kids. Then, taking a lesson from the survivalists' own guidebook, they throw a hive of bees inside the camper to flush everyone out, leaving the woods behind for civilization. The great outdoors have always been viewed as a proving ground by people who like to believe they can thrive without the amenities of modern living, that showing off how well you can survive without infrastructure can also show off one's value as a person. But this is far from a pragmatic truth, because the real value of a parent would come from how effectively they can raise their kids in the conditions in which they're living. You don't live in the woods, you live in society, so a good person is one who fits into that society and can guide others in doing the same. So different groups, still clinging to this ideal, each come up with their own version of how to combine these two desires. Some folks are like the survivalists, fetishizing a post-apocalyptic scenario in their head where they can show off how well they do off the grid, in part because they failed to survive on the grid. Others create a commodified version of the outdoors, like Tina's Thunder Girls camp, where they sing campfire songs and sell cookies while pretending their organization is any more than a business in which they're the low-ranked pawns. And then there are people like Bob, who replace their failures in business in the financial realm by fishing and hunting. It's ultimately those like the rest of the Belcher family who have the right way to explore the outdoors, people who are just having a good time, enjoying what they can in life without trying to prove anything to anyone. Fortnite. It's Halloween night, and the kids are planning on collecting candy in a massive dragon costume that Bob and Linda are making. While planning their trick-or-treating route inside a fort they've built in the alleyway, a truck backs up to the cardboard boxes and traps them inside, with their only contact with the outside world being Millie, a stalker obsessed with Louise who revels in the fact that her friend is trapped. But after Millie refuses to get help and Louise snaps at her, Millie starts to actively sabotage their attempts to escape, shutting the nearby dumpster and redirecting Bob and Linda from nearly discovering that they're trapped. This results in Bob and Linda deciding to take their hard work out on their own, trick-or-treating as a duo despite people recognizing them beneath the costume. Ultimately, the kids are able to formulate an accidental escape when they nearly crush themselves beneath the truck's hydraulic lift, barely blocking the lift with piled-up garbage before they're able to crawl out. In the end, they hide on top of the truck and convince Millie that they're dead, spooking her into leaving her candy behind for them to enjoy. On this second Halloween episode, Bob's Burgers makes an affectionate parody of horror stories like Stephen King's Misery, not so much in the actual events of the story, but in the terror of the situation without holding back from the more terrifying implications of the situation. So while the episode has the same humor that defines the rest of the show, it's still a Halloween episode spiritually, because it holds back from trivializing the actual danger or claustrophobic environments. Millie is introduced as a foil to Louise, a character who is totally obsessed with her to the point of obnoxiousness in spite of the fact that Louise regularly employs others for her schemes and would no doubt benefit from a toady willing to go along with her. The difference in dynamic here, however, comes from the fact that Millie is not a blind fangirl of Louise's, but rather she's the one to try to take the lead. She plans things without the consent or input of Louise, putting the dynamic into reverse as Louise is suddenly the one having roles and ideas put in front of her instead of the other way around. And so this is something that Louise hates most of all, not being the one in charge. Seaplane. Tired of going on the same date over and over, Linda signs herself and Bob up for seaplane flying lessons. But Bob refuses to go, so Linda goes alone and is enjoying herself. But Mr. Fishoder arrives and notices the flyer, telling Bob that the seaplane lessons are taught by a man known as Upskirt Kirk, who usually fakes engine troubles and a crash landing to sleep with the woman using adrenaline as an aphrodisiac. So Bob takes the kids with him to make sure Linda is not being seduced, rushing from island to island to make it to Kipikisset Island, ultimately rowing there in time to see that Linda has rejected all of the pilot's advances, as well as the fact that their seaplane is missing due to rising tides. But Mr. Fishodor arrives with his boat and the plane in tow, offering the family a ride in the plane as he and Kirk take it back to shore. However, as they're sailing home, Fishodor goes too fast and the seaplane takes off, just before they're about to pass under a bridge. So Bob climbs out onto the wing and severs the rope with a wine cork with enough time to spare for Linda to fly them over it, ultimately landing the plane with the lesson she got from Kirk during his fake emergency. The surest way to tell when a relationship isn't going to work is when the couple never fights or argues, because it's impossible that any two people would have absolutely no disagreements between them. So some sort of argument is inevitable at some point, and the way that the couple resolves the disagreement is indicative of how many of these fights they can possibly survive. If they never fight, it means that the resentment will only fester, or worse, that they can't communicate. Obviously, bad communication means a relationship will fail, but bad communication is not just a lack of it, but a hostile version too. Bob and Linda start this episode with a fight that results in the two of them going their separate ways for the next date. And while someone like Upskirt Kirk might view this as a sign that they're vulnerable, to Bob and Linda, it's anything but. They've fought before, but they've never broken up over these disagreements. The two love each other far too much for a minor thing like where to go on a date to cause any considerable strain on the relationship. Kirk is operating on the idea that any couple who fights is weaker for doing so, and as a guy who's poor in terms of his own love life, this would be the case. My Big Fat Greek Bob. Bob is substituting as the cook for the Beta fraternity for a week, and while there, meets the other members and gets involved in their culture, assisting with a prank against the Alpha House and drinking out of their taxidermied iguana, Beta. Later on, he meets a frequent donor/alumni, Dr. Yap, aka Slowhand, who grows angry that Bob is involved with the fraternity more than he is. But when Slowhand gets his head shaved by the Alphas, who also leave behind embarrassing photos of their mascot, the rest of the frat vows to go on a prank war as revenge, ultimately ending up with a probation notice from the dean. But Slowhand insists that they go through with a huge prank anyway, setting up 6 months' worth of dentist spit to spray the head of the Alpha frat at a charity award ceremony. Meanwhile, the kids have been trying to sneak into the Room of Secrets inside the fraternity, ultimately discovering a secret stash with evidence that Dr. Yap has been behind all of the Alpha pranks up to that point, even shaving his own head. And when Bob learns of this, he rushes over to stop the prank. While on stage trying to talk the rest of the Beta House down, Slowhand rushes over and sets off the spit tank, spraying the stage and getting Bob and Slowhand banned from the fraternity, something the rest of the brothers are grateful for as they were tired of the dentist's antics. Meanwhile, Linda and Gretchen sell lady goods out of the restaurant, with their last meeting being crashed by the frat boys showing up during a sale to a bunch of cougars. Bob never went to college, as he never saw a need to do so. He's learned the burger business already, so why bother with something as irrelevant? And yet, there's a large amount of cultural influence placed on the college experience, especially in American pop culture. A sort of brotherhood as formed by the frat houses and class organizations that people use to propel their social lives into adulthood. Or at least, that's the pop culture version of events. The reality is that most people who go to college are there to attend classes and get a degree, not to get drunk. After all, you don't have to spend thousands of dollars to do this. But not everybody has gotten this memo, least of all, Dr. Yap. He wanted the pop culture version of the college experience, only to have instead discovered a group of people who are living together while studying, with the crazy prank wars and partying being a very small aspect of their culture if it exists at all. But instead of accepting that he was wrong to have such expectations, he doubles down on the prank wars, using it as a substitute for his social life as he predicates his social activities with an in-group people want to be a part of, instead of a more naturally forming friendship. And he even knows this, even in the back of his mind, as he was jealous of Bob for having the same thing he wanted, without Bob ever having to lean into pop culture traditions and unrealistic expectations. Turkey in a can. Bob is doing a 3-day brine of the Thanksgiving turkey, trying to balance that with his family. Tina, who's trying to sit at the adults' table, Jean, who's trying to write a holiday song for Linda to sing during dinner, and Gail, who has brought 3 cats over for the holidays. But the next night he wakes up to see that the turkey has been thrown in the toilet, and everybody's a suspect, though they agree to blame Louise and get on with the holidays. So Bob prepares a 2-day brine instead, politely rejecting the offers of the butcher, only for that turkey to wind up in the toilet as well. Louise starts trying to clear her name, searching for potential suspects as Bob buys 2 turkeys, hiding one in the walk-in and only telling Linda about it. But when both turkeys wind up in both toilets, Bob starts blaming people as Linda reveals that she told everyone else about the secret turkey. So Bob ends up buying a turkey the day before and stays up all night until he's finally able to serve it properly, ignoring Louise's conclusion about her siblings conspiring against her. But when Bob falls asleep at the table, he picks up the turkey and carries it to the bathroom, hallucinating that the bird is Tina and she's still being potty trained, a result of the fact that Bob was afraid Tina was growing up too quickly, and the allergy medication he took to deal with Gail's cats. Bob's love of Thanksgiving makes a comeback here, this time being presented in the context of his desire for consistency in his life. He wants to keep things as similar to last year as every year, and so he shoots down any changes, like Jean trying to create a new tradition, or Tina changing tables. The entire plot of this episode being a result of his subconscious desire to relive the early years of his oldest daughter's youngest years, as though they never passed. If the kids don't grow up, then nothing can change. But a basic understanding of linear time proves why this won't work. Eventually people do grow older, and they do change as the years go on, and Bob not only rejects this idea, but rejects even acknowledging that he's rejected the idea. He blames others for sabotaging the turkey, despite the fact that, if you grabbed a turkey brine with your bare hands like that, you would have salty fingers. Bob had to, on some level, known it was him. It's not until he's caught in the act that Bob finally accepts that he's resistant to this change, and in seeing how many turkeys he's ruined in the interest of pushing back, he's forced to acknowledge why he's fighting so hard in the first place, and that his reasons aren't enough to justify holding back his family. Purple Rain Union. Linda's old band, the Tatas, gets invited to play at her 25-year high school reunion, despite the fact that their previous performance, a high school talent show, ended with them being laughed off the stage. Linda gets the whole band back together, including her sister Gail, though she has to agree to allow Gail to play one of her songs at the concert, despite how weirdly sexual they are, and the band practices in the basement. But on the day of the concert, Bob gets a massive pimple on his face, wanting to stay home because of its size. They go anyway, only for the band that beat them in the talent show, the conventionally successful Bad Hair Day, is able to play after all, and Linda starts to panic over the fact that she might relive that dreadful talent show. Meanwhile, Jen is hired to babysit the kids after Tina lost her babysitting privileges due to incompetence. But a jealous Tina coordinates with Louise, who wants to see the train wreck of Linda's performance, to threaten Jen with tickling unless she takes them to the high school, and Jen reacts badly, giving Tina a black eye. So they all give each other black eyes to keep Jen's job after Tina regrets the act and go over to the high school anyway, only to see a sobbing Linda walking down the street. Jen gives her a motivational speech about doing things even if she knows they won't turn out great, and she returns to the reunion, ignoring Bob, who's been having a great time, and Gail performs her weird sexual song only for everyone to love it. The things that are important to high schoolers are almost never important in real life. That is to say, teenagers care far too much about certain trivial matters to the point of being overly dramatic about whether their band is good or their zit is noticeable. Bob thinks the high school reunion will be just like high school. If he shows up with acne, people will make fun of him. But he arrives, and instead of being a mark of shame, the zit is instead the topic of conversation, many different people approaching him and making a big deal out of it, but in a good way. Far from making fun of him for it, they're instead fascinated, and the pimple is even smaller later on in the night as the treatments they suggest actually work. Linda, too, becomes obsessed over playing second fiddle to the much more popular Bad Hair Day during her teenage years. This paranoia results in her assuming she's about to relive the worst parts of high school, when the reality is that she got to relive the best parts. As awkward as Gail's song was, it was well received by the audience due to the genuine message it had. The song even successfully managing to attract the man it was about in spite of the copious focus on neck hair. Bob and Deliver. Bob learns from Mr. Frond that the home ec class is being shut down while the teacher is on paid leave, and Bob offers to substitute. Tina is eager to become a teacher's pet in Bob's class, but Bob quickly learns that the class is little more than a room where problem kids watch VHS tapes to keep them out of trouble. But Bob can't stand for this, and after an unsuccessful day of teaching, returns with the intention of giving more practical lessons to the students, such as cooking popcorn. Soon the students start to love his class, and even Zeke discovers a passion for cooking, with the class becoming so popular that Bob opens up a home restaurant inside the school to sell meals to the kids. But Kafko, the business in charge of selling meals in the cafeteria, catches wind of the home restaurant and shuts it down by going directly to Frond. Undeterred, Bob sets out to run one last meal before he's banned and manages to gather the class, as well as Tina, who transferred to Metal Shop when it was clear she wasn't Bob's favorite, so they can run the home restaurant in the cafeteria. Meanwhile, Linda tries to teach Teddy how to dance, with the guy ultimately learning everything he can from her with the help of alcohol. The home restaurant is far more successful than Bob's Burgers, not merely in the fact that it's consistently a packed house, but in the sense of the satisfaction from who is working there. In part, this is because Bob was able to overthrow an existing system to replace it with something more pure-hearted. Kafko is a business with a greater concern for money-making than selling food. Nothing about their business model has the students' best interests at heart, or even to help other teachers with their lessons. But the home restaurant is something that only makes money as a side effect of Bob's real intentions, to teach kids in a way that's engaging. Because the previous home ec teacher simply put on a video and then tuned out Zeke's commentary on it, instead of bothering to teach the class for real. And this creates a feedback loop where the students have no interest in learning because they don't understand the value of what they could be taught. So Bob is able to act in a passionate way about his craft, and that passion is just as contagious as the indifference of the Kafko workers and management. It's caught by the students in the cafeteria and the home ec courses. Christmas in the car. Linda gets the Christmas tree way too early, resulting in the tree dying before Christmas Day. So Bob and the rest of the family head out on Christmas Eve to get a new one out of the runts that remained untaken. Bob is nervous about going out, as he has a ham in the oven, but Linda assures him that they'll be home in time to take it out. This goes awry when Bob accidentally cuts off a man driving a candy cane-shaped truck, and the truck driver proceeds to harass them on the road, driving them into a ditch outside of a diner. Bob tells Teddy to come over and turn off the oven, then tries to get an officer's help while Linda orders a Dutch baby, and Gene waits on hold to get his favorite Christmas song played on the radio, which eventually uses up the rest of the phone's battery. The family leaves the diner and are then chased by the candy cane truck again, eventually hiding the car in the woods, where they end up stuck in some snow. Realizing they're going to spend Christmas in the car, Linda tries to lead them through some carols before the candy cane shows up again while they're cornered. Bob confronts the driver, who's actually just a small man who's had a more stressful day than they have, and being cut off was his last straw. Bob allows the man to punch him in the stomach, and Linda gives him the Dutch baby in exchange for being towed out of the snow, and they return home to find Teddy trapped under the fridge because of the kids' Santa trap. The holidays are a stressful time of the year. There's a ton of planning that needs to be done, and then the inevitable last-minute changes to those plans once they go awry. The further in advance you plan things, the more likely it is you're not sticking to those plans, like Linda getting 2 trees too early. And through all of the stress that we ourselves go through, it's common to forget that everyone else around you is going through the same thing. The cop in the diner that Bob tries to get the attention of is unhelpful, but was also off-duty, working on Christmas Eve, and had a guy with no evidence trying to get him to stop a vague crime. And the villain of the episode is just a man who's been pushed past a reasonable limit by one tiny thing, a thing he even recognizes as such, who takes out his anger on the first family car he sees at the expense of being late for a Christmas parade he already thinks he might not make. Decisions made in anger cannot be undone, but neither can decisions made out of sympathy. At the end of the episode, everything gets resolved when Bob and Linda offer the man in the candy cane truck some pancakes and a tree, actions done to bring peace to the situation that end with them being unstuck, their reward for not escalating the situation to further violence. Slumber Party. When Linda finds out that Louise hates slumber parties, she decides to host one herself and invites a bunch of other girls from Louise's class over. Louise does not want to have this party, so she convinces the girls one by one to leave by exploiting their fears, telling Jody that her mother has an infection, Harley that Jean has a grotesque twin brother, and Abby that she won't let that girl braid her hair. But the last of the girls, Jessica, went to bed early only to disappear and begin hiding around the house, taunting Louise through a walkie-talkie while she searches for something. Meanwhile, Linda has been observing the raccoons in the alley, only to notice that her favorite, Little King Trashmouth, has been kicked out of the dumpster by a much larger raccoon named El Diablo. So she and Bob work with Teddy to trap El Diablo while Trashmouth stays in their bedroom, until he escapes and heads into the bathroom where the girls were tie-dyeing shirts. He steals the thing Jessica was looking for, evidence of her bedwetting, and Jessica is mortified about the reveal until Louise tells her that she has no interest in telling the rest of the school about the incident, as they genuinely bonded during a pillow fight. Louise, who has never had a sleepover, hates sleepovers. She assumes they're boring and typical girly fare, the kind of thing she's constantly rejected her whole life. Louise, who doesn't know Jessica very well, hates Jessica. She assumes she's a boring and typical girly girl, the type of person she's consistently rejected her whole life. As much as Louise has always wanted to eschew the mundane and normal lifestyles of the people she looks down upon, there's something to be said for looking down on people you don't know, because from all the way up on a pedestal, one tends to lose touch with reality. She ends up inadvertently pushing Jessica into a rough situation that mirrors her own, being pushed to go to a sleepover you don't want to be at, and then being pushed away from that sleepover while you still have unfinished business to cover up. The other girls are all tricked into leaving early, leaving before Louise gets the chance to know them, not that she would have taken that chance in the first place. But when she and Jessica start to fight, the two grow closer due to the shared stress of the situation, and out of this, Louise learns that there are no boring events, just boring people at the events, but also that there are no boring people, just people you haven't gotten to know yet. Presto Tina-O. A festival of magic is in town, and Bob prepares for the swarm of magicians by offering a discount, hoping that it will attract a few people willing to do magic tricks. But a magician, Mars Sazerac, comes in and picks Bob's pocket as a trick, later bringing his magician friends over to take advantage of his hospitality by taking up the whole restaurant without ordering much. So Bob bans all magicians from the store and gets his name placed into a book of magicians' enemies. Over the next few days, a series of weird events strikes the restaurant, leading him to believe he's been cursed. Meanwhile, Tina is trying to become Jimmy Jr.'s magician's assistant, but grows tired of the fact that his magic act is mostly just dancing. So she sets out to make her own magic act, and when she finds he's replaced her with Tammy, to sabotage his performance. But during the show, after replacing his dance music with something in 9/8 time, she feels bad about the sabotage and takes the stage to try to get out of a straitjacket to save his show. Meanwhile, Bob sneaks backstage to lick all the meat in Sazerac's dressing room while also tearing his name out of the Magician's Enemies book. But Louise picks Sazerac's pocket, only to discover that Sazerac was a step ahead all along, having farted on the meat before Bob entered. Bob's love of magic from Boys for Now shows itself again, only to vanish into thin air upon meeting a magician up close and having a bad experience with him. He bans the whole career path from his restaurant in what would have been considered an overreaction if Sazerac didn't immediately justify it with a series of magical pranks without much of an explanation outside of breaking and entering. Bob's Burgers is a show very grounded in realism, so an actual curse is out of the question here. Meanwhile, Tina starts the episode loving Jimmy Jr. and wanting to get close to his magic act, mirroring Bob's magic obsession. But once she actually gets some exposure to the hobby, she likewise realizes it's overblown and sets out to take down the guy with the competing act. She ramps this up when she becomes further offended at Tammy taking her old spot, only to regret her actions later. Seeing a person that she likes suffering doesn't make her feel any better, but feel worse for having taken the low road. So while Bob licking fart meat, weird sentence, comes across as justice, Tina learns from her mistake and tries to make peace, letting her win an award for onstage synergy and an equally satisfying conclusion to the episode. Easy commercial, easy Go-Mercial. Hoping to one-up Jimmy Pesto's Super Bowl festivities, Bob gets the idea to run a local Super Bowl commercial starring his family. They have Louise write the script, with Jean writing a song for Linda to sing, and get to work on the filming itself, only to realize they don't really know what they're doing. So Bob hires Randy to direct, taking the position from a jealous Louise, and they get to work on creating a commercial that's a terrible mess. Realizing this, Bob asks Teddy to use a connection to a former NFL player to get them some celebrity recognition, and Teddy brings in Sandy Can Fry to do a segment. When the new commercial is finally done and makes it to air, the rest of the Belcher family is horrified to find out they're barely in it, and Bob's horrified to learn that Fry has done another similar commercial for Jimmy Pesto's. So Bob heads over to shut down Pesto's party, only to get food thrown at him by the angry customers, who accuse Bob of ripping off Jimmy, and when Bob realizes his mistake out loud, his family is glad to see him come around. Finally, after several days of holding in a super bowel movement, Gene uses the toilets at Jimmy Pesto's, flooding the bathroom and making all the customers leave, with a few showing up to Bob's Burgers. The family's commercial was bad, not just in its construction, but in the sense that it barely even advertised what it was supposed to do. Bob makes a new commercial to replace it, only for that commercial to also fail at what it needs to do. Not so much in the sense that it failed to bring people to the restaurant, but in the sense that it failed to sell the appeal of Bob's Burgers. In-universe and out, Bob's Burgers is a show/restaurant about the family. Having everybody contributing in some small way is what makes the show work. It's about their relationships to one another. But this isn't something that makes food sell, just stories. So in-universe, Bob's Burgers will always fail for the same reason that we, the audience, love it. But there are some things in life other than family, either necessities or desires. Bob can spend as much quality time with his family at the restaurant as he wants to, but that won't feed them or keep the doors open. He wants to spend time with his family, but he needs to run a business. He also wants to one-up Jimmy Pesto, the entire reason he went all out for the Super Bowl in the first place. So when these conflicting desires all meet up with one another, Bob ends up being forced to decide where his priorities lie, and he ultimately settles on siding with what his family wanted too. The Frond Files. Wagstaff has an essay exposition, and the Belchers are unable to find the essays their children wrote. So Bob and Linda confront Mr. Frond to ask him where they are, and he reveals that the essays they submitted were too creative, and reads them as proof. In a futuristic reference to The Terminator, Louise's essay is about a futuristic robot being sent back in time to prevent Louise from pranking Frond by putting a brownie on his chair, the man locking himself away to enact his revenge. She runs away from a killer Frond bot, receiving exposition from Daryl before hiding in the cafeteria with her siblings, eventually discovering that hot creamed corn can melt his skin. So Louise lures him into the kitchen, where he falls into a vat of the stuff, only to reveal several other Frond bots that force the Belcher kids into hiding, where Louise writes her essay. In a reference to Rock and Roll High School, Gene's story replaces Wagstaff with the Fart School for the Gifted, where Gene is playing fart noises on his keyboard before getting it confiscated by Mr. Frond. So he teams up with his siblings to sneak into the office and rescue the keyboard, where Gene's able to break into a song about farting that literally blows everybody away and also destroys the school. Finally, it's Tina's story, another of her erotic friend fictions, where she's a hall monitor flirting with the JV basketball team. But when a jock itch serum goes wrong before a pep rally, the school becomes infested with jock zombies. Tina and her siblings try to go to the teacher's lounge for safety, but Mr. Frond locks them out before getting bit himself. Cornered, Tina ends up noticing that she can stop the zombies by flipping her hair, and she diffuses the zombie infestation by flirting with them, eventually dating an entire zombie basketball team before Bob and Linda decide to stop reading it there before it gets weirder. Ultimately, Mr. Frond reveals that his real reason for not showing the essays was the fact that he was the bad guy in all of them, and that he wants the kids to like him for once. Bob and Linda give some half-hearted suggestions before discovering that Mr. Frond sat on a brownie Louise placed there before. Mazel Tina. Tammy is having her bat mitzvah, but Tina isn't invited, so she arranges to have Bob's Burgers cater the event in order to get an invitation, an arrangement Bob accepts despite knowing that his family tends to wander off during events like this. The Tammy-themed bat mitzvah starts, and Tammy is a batzilla, being extremely demanding of everyone around her, especially the overworked Janet, who Louise convinces to quit in order to get away from the girl. Not wanting the party to get off schedule, Tammy recruits Tina as her replacement assistant, giving her the schedule and headset to take charge. But later, when Tammy catches Louise trying to pour guacamole out of the giant papier-mâché Tammy head, the two wind up trapped inside, with the music being too loud to hear their cries for help. Tina proceeds to replace Tammy as the star of the event, eventually ignoring Louise's cries for help when she fixes the headset to continue to be Tammy. Meanwhile, Linda sneaks off to eat all the other food at the party, with Bob joining her until they realize they've wandered into a completely different reception hall entirely, with Gene left to manage the catering stand himself, serving raw hamburgers to the attendees. In the end, Louise and Tammy manage to break out of the giant head, only for Tammy to be lifted away before Tina can face any consequences. Tina, once again, becomes Tammy, the same story we saw from the episode Bad Tina where the character was introduced. But here, the plots change through the fact that it's Tina who wants to take over instead of Tina being pressured to do so. Early in the episode, Tina is upset over the fact that she doesn't get invited to social events and isn't popular enough to hang out with the other kids. She tries to convince Tammy to let her family cater as a way to work her way up the social ladder, but ultimately ends up taking a shortcut that presents itself in the form of taking over for Tammy entirely. But it's not Tina who's popular here, but Tammy 2.0, just as it was before. Except the lesson is flipped, as it's no longer Tina blindly doing whatever other people tell her to do, but rather Tina telling other people to do what she wants. She hasn't merely adopted Tammy's position, but her personality as well, for all the faults she has, which are put on full display when she and Louise are trapped inside the giant head. Louise being so annoyed by the other girl that she actively sabotages the rescue attempts just to make sure she suffers. Uncle Teddy. Bob and Linda are going to an in-person meetup for a burger forum, but their usual sitter is out of town. So Teddy volunteers to watch the kids while they're away. He struggles with getting them interested in any of his planned activities and eventually gives up to leave them alone while he instinctively fixes a few things around the house. Soon he's able to get their attention by unclogging the sink drain and letting them name and adopt the hairball down there. But Tina is less interested as the sandwich delivery place nearby has a new driver, Jonas, and she tries to flirt with him, eventually resulting in Jonas inviting a few friends over to crash in the empty restaurant. But when Teddy kicks them out, they go to the lighthouse instead, with Tina following along, eventually getting into trouble with a park ranger after her new friends abandon her there. Back at the burger meetup, Bob discovers that none of the other attendees like him due to his behavior online not reading as sarcastic, and they shun Bob and Linda. This results in a scuffle where they refuse to leave the hot tub after the rest of the cooks demand they leave until hotel security kicks them out. Bob and Linda pour condiments into the tub and run off, coming back home in time to see Teddy and the kids on the side of the road, Teddy having just rescued Tina and the others. Teddy goes into watching the kids with expectations of what child rearing might be like, a list of things he wants to do with them, only to find out that it's significantly more boring than that, as well as the fact that what the kids want to do is not exactly what he's prepared to deal with. But what he is prepared to do is to go to work normally, fixing a few of the plumbing issues around the house and immediately getting the younger kids to treat him as though he were their father. This is no different from how Bob treats his kids, working alongside them as they all bother him with whatever interests them about his workplace at the moment. All Teddy needed to do was what Bob did all the time, and stop forcing it so much. Bob himself struggles to make friends with his friends, meeting up with people he's only ever known on the internet, only to find out that nobody really likes him. Offline, there are plenty of facial expressions, body language quirks, and vocal intonations that one can use to identify tone and the like, adapting the way you speak and are spoken to make more clear communication. But online, a lot of this goes out the window as certain tonal indicators are gone, and a person used to speaking that way might struggle to communicate without realizing it. Bob is a nice person, but he doesn't act like one, indifferent to his kids despite deeply caring about them. But online, that does not come across clearly, so Bob has no idea how abrasive he can be. The kids rob a train. Bob and Linda go on a wine train to unwind, taking the kids with them. But Jean, Louise, and Tina find out that kids on the train have to stay in the caboose, alongside regular-sized Rudy, something they especially don't want to do as they passed a chocolate fountain on the way there. So they make a plan to sneak out, with Louise stealing not the chocolate fountain, but the chocolate bars from the kitchen. This plan almost works, but when trying to retrieve Louise, the rest of the kids fall out of the train and wind up stranded, barely making it back in time to enjoy the chocolate that they had to stash on the roof, which melts into a makeshift fountain of their own. Meanwhile, Bob and Linda invite a wine enthusiast, Rick, to taste with them, but Bob is put off by his snobbish ways, and they enter a wine-off. Bob is losing badly, but gets the chance to take home everything if he can guess one wine correctly, and he lets Linda choose. After a bit of tasting, Bob reveals that the answer was the spit bucket, with Rick throwing his wine in Bob's face, resulting in the whole car starting a wine fight. In the end, the wine-soaked adults meet up with the chocolate-soaked kids, and they return home before the staff on board the train can do anything about the theft. A heist movie with the Bob's Burgers twist on it. The kids stealing a bunch of chocolate in order to get back at a train attendant who locked them in a room so they wouldn't annoy the adults trying to wine taste. Thinking logically, it's likely that had the kids been allowed to roam free, they inevitably would have been getting into some trouble involving the chocolate fountain, or wound up getting everyone messy as they did to themselves in the happy ending. Though the idea is also pragmatic from a writer's perspective as well, a means of getting the kids away from the feud between Bob and Rick. This feud over who can appreciate wine the most comes with an extra bit of irony due to the fact that Bob is as obsessed over burgers as Rick is with wine, his own traits and desire to turn things he's good at into a contest becoming the exact type of trait he finds annoying in another. As this argument evolves, the methods in the argument devolve, turning a metaphorical contest into a literal one before finally throwing glasses at one another's faces. Ironically, in a plot where the adults are separate from the kids, the adults end up acting just like the kids did independently. I get a psychic out of you. After Linda bumps her head on the counter, she's able to predict where Mort left his wallet and that an incoming call is a telemarketer. She starts to believe that she has psychic powers, much to the annoyance of Bob, who doesn't believe. Linda then proceeds to make a series of predictions for the regular restaurant patrons, including helping the kids to pick out a horse in the upcoming races, and the fact that Bob will fall down the stairs. The kids then convince Teddy to take them to the tracks, where he believes he'll find the woman of his dreams while placing a bet on the Belchers' behalf, while Linda is recruited by Sergeant Bosco for her help in locating a missing statue. She's taken to the Wharf Arts Center to catch the little boy bandit on a hunch of hers later, but can't seem to pick up any leads. After all the predictions Linda made before failed to come true, and Bob learns that Teddy is with the kids at the racetrack, he rushes over to save them, only for Tina to try to get the autograph of a horse whose jockey accidentally ousts himself as the little boy bandit. Bob calls the police to the race, and they arrest him just before he would have won. In the end, Linda admits that she doesn't have any psychic powers and simply used common sense without realizing it. And then Bob falls down the stairs. Most psychics' powers work the same way that Linda's powers worked in this episode, by playing off whatever the person being scanned wants to hear, while throwing in a bit of common sense as well. How did Linda know the statue was in the ocean? It's a big statue, it couldn't have gone far. How did she know Teddy would meet a woman in yellow? She just sort of guessed based on what he was saying. And how did she manage to predict so many things for everyone else? She didn't. The fact that people like Teddy went so far out of their way to make their predictions come true shows just how likely it was she could err on the side of being correct. Anyone can be proven right by a person stretching the definition of correct to better fit their beliefs. But once these predictions start to involve third parties, they start to become less accurate. Linda might be able to inadvertently affect Teddy or Gretchen's behavior, but you can't change the outcome of a horse race or behavior of an ex-lover. People are quick to play word association when you start talking to them with random words, but these associations only go two ways, except the person interpreting the vision is also the one who is subconsciously trying to make it happen and prove themselves right. If not for believing in the prediction, then at the very least because they spent money on one. The Equestronauts. The Belcher family attends a convention for Tina's favorite show, The Equestronauts, only for Tina to feel as though she doesn't belong at the convention due to the fact that most of the other fans there are middle-aged men. But some of these men, led by a man named Bronconius, approach Tina and befriend her, only to use this as leverage to convince her to trade her rare misprinted chariot doll away. When the rest of the family learns she's been swindled, they come up with a plan to have Bob take the doll back by going undercover, memorizing as much about the Equestronauts as possible and using a homemade costume to infiltrate the group to discover the whereabouts of the doll. Bob is able to befriend Bronconius and and becomes a part of his inner circle, eventually getting invited to an after-party where Bronconius shows him his collection of toys, as well as the fact that he believes that kissing the toys will make him eternally young. But Tina suddenly realizes that part of Bob's equestronaut training included reading her zombie horse fanfiction, and she rushes over to stop him before he ousts himself as a fake fan, only to catch him mid-to-two as Bronconius figured out the ruse and is trying to punish him. But Tina appeals to the rest of the group's sense of decency and love for the show, convincing them to put a stop to the tattooing and calling over hotel security to retrieve the ill-gotten toy. This episode makes an obvious parody of the modern My Little Pony fandom referring to themselves as bronies. But rather than going after the low-hanging fruit of simply pointing out how silly it is for adult men to like a thing for young children, it actually portrays the majority of these men as reasonable actors, simply coming together to celebrate their love of a media franchise. The villain of the episode is a single guy taking out his obsession too far, something that exists in any fandom, and he's ultimately taken down by the good-natured people of the Equestronaut fandom who far outnumber him. But what is it about fandoms like this that can breed this sort of individual? There are types out there who value themselves by their participation in another group. The more you fit in, the better you are at being you, and the only way to prove that you yourself belong is by gatekeeping others from the circle. A true fan of something would be eager to accept others into the group, excited to be someone's guide into the fandom that they love so much, to talk about your favorite things with a person who has the capacity to appreciate it. So the only people who try to force others out of their hobbies are the people who never really liked the hobby in the first place, but still valued their participation as a part of their identity, or crazy people. Ambergris. While walking around at low tide, the Belcher kids find a weird-smelling chunk that they decide to take home, only to learn that they've found ambergris, a substance that whales produce to help them with digesting squid beaks, and that a chunk of it, that size, is worth up to $30,000. But as whales are endangered, it's illegal to sell ambergris, so Louise arranges to have it sold on the black market through Mickey at the pier. But when Mickey tells them the name of a buyer he's arranged, Louise plots to cut him out of the deal and go to that buyer directly. But Jean and Tina get concerned about Louise's behavior and swap the ambergris for a cantaloupe before she does something stupid. Tina then plans to get rid of the ambergris before it can tear them apart even further, eventually throwing it into a deep fryer where it melts. Meanwhile, Mr. Fischoder's brother Felix comes over as his inheritance has run out, and he passes the landlording duties on to him. When Bob asks Felix to call a plumber to fix the hot water in the bathroom, Felix goes overboard and throws an elaborate unveiling party for a new, modern bathroom, and doesn't actually fix the water. Louise's mentality in this episode is one obviously motivated by greed, but her mistake is not simply in her own greed, but in assuming that everyone else's mentality won't reflect that, on either extreme. When she plans to cut Mickey out of the plan, she doesn't see an issue with doing so, confused as to why her siblings wouldn't be on board with the same thing. Then, when she hands over what she believes is the ambergris to the nose, she gets it stolen as she's by herself and very small. Likely something that wouldn't have happened if she hadn't gone out of her way to cut other people out of the deal up to that point. It's also beyond Louise to imagine that her own siblings would have plotted behind her back, in spite of the fact that she herself admitted to wanting to cut them out as soon as she had reason to do so. The one thing that prevents her from being scammed out of a lot of ambergris money, but not from losing everything entirely. Elsewhere in this episode is Felix attempts to fix up the bathroom in Bob's Burgers, something later revealed to be a replacement for an inferiority complex he has with his brother. As he puts so much of his own self-conscious thinking into the project, he ultimately winds up taking it too far, revamping the bathroom without addressing the original issue, as the original issue wasn't his concern in the first place. The kids run away. Louise is afraid of the dentist, which gets worse when Dr. Yap discovers that she has a cavity that needs to be filled. Rather than going through with the procedure, she runs out the window, eventually winding up at Gail's when she fails to check out a hotel room with Bob's credit card. Bob and Linda find out she's there, but also know that Louise likely won't want to come back with them to get the cavity filled. So they make a compromise by placing a bet. If Louise can last the entire week with Aunt Gail, she won't have to go to the dentist's. They drop off Tina and Jean, with Tina offering to serve as an inside woman, texting updates to her parents and scheming to flush out Louise by having Gail be extra annoying. This includes urging Gail to read her poetry and having the family play a board game she invented. Bob and Linda plan a stakeout outside of Gail's flat as a contingency plan in case Louise tries to run away, only for Louise to last the whole week. So as a last-second plan, they give a celebratory ice cream breakfast to her that hurts her cavity, with Louise realizing she needs to go to the dentist anyway as Gail plans a game of make-believe to convince her to go along. Louise is afraid of the dentist, but not quite as afraid of that as she is of her parents beating her in a bet, such as whether she can stand Gail for a week or not. So she puts up with her aunt in the interest of doing things on her own terms, being annoyed by her poetry and board games while covered in cat scratches. But it's all her decision to do, so it's better than going to the dentist. The one thing that Louise values above all else is having this level of control, and so this is why she's able to be brought to the dentist at the end of the episode. While she still dislikes the idea of going to Dr. Yap's again, she's also begun to recognize that it's a necessity to do so when eating ice cream hurts. But she's still stalwart in her refusal to admit that her parents were correct, so another plan is needed. Ultimately, Gail is able to use imagination to get her to go, pretending it's a game of sorts that, despite Louise not really being into it, still gets her into the dentist's chair. Not because it's fun to do so, but because she can pretend it's just a happy accident she got the dental work afterwards. It was her choice to play the game, not her parents', and thus, it's her victory when Gail convinces her to accept being parented in this way. Gene it on. Tina is excited to try out for the cheerleading squad, but not as excited as Linda is to be a cheer mom. Tina ultimately does not make it, but Gene's enthusiasm as he cheers on his sister ends up attracting the attention of Mr. Ambrose, and he makes the team instead. As Mr. Ambrose admits that he wanted to coach drama but got stuck with the cheerleaders instead, he decides to artificially create drama by pitting Gene against the former Yell King, Todd, which results in the two getting into a cheer battle that Gene wins. Ambrose then tries to have Todd plan revenge against Gene, but drops this when the squad gets invited to regional finals, where he creates drama again by leaking their routine before the event. So Gene, after having a falling out with Linda, decides to make up with her by using a routine she invented the day before, involving a massive wheel of cheerleaders that predictably fails, crushing Mr. Ambrose, who pretends it was a selfless act of heroism. Meanwhile, Tina's tongue is swollen after biting it during her cheer tryout, and Louise follows her around as her interpreter, lying about what her sister is saying, which ultimately gets her a date with Jimmy Jr. to a revolving restaurant. Louise takes advantage of her sister being unable to speak to order more and more pie, and then she ends up eating too much and vomiting as Jimmy Jr. is finally able to start to understand Tina. It's interesting to consider the more overt messaging of this episode compared to the message that was actually sent, and then to compare this to what a normal show would have done with this sort of plot. Ordinarily, this would be a straightforward plot about discovering the spirit of competition, or what it means to be a cheerleader. Then Linda and Mr. Ambrose would have realized that they were wrong to try to force their dreams onto the kids, and that they should have been more supportive of the event itself instead of obsessing over image or drama. And yet, this fabricated drama and character obsession is also a part of what it means to be in an event. While Ambrose may have sabotaged their chances at the cheer meet, it was a cheer meet they didn't even know existed, and all of it was in the interest of making a more overall enjoyable experience. Linda obsesses with the idea of being a cheer mom, not because she actually values the idea of being a cheer mom, but because it's fun to pretend to be a diva for a time. Even her past feud with Monica was totally one-sided, but it's something that Linda still remembers because she was the one who played up the obsession, for worse, and surprisingly, for better. Wharf Horse. Felix Fischoeder tries to convince Bob to convince his brother Calvin Fischoeder to sell Wonder Wharf to develop condos there. Bob and Linda are hesitant about this deal at first, until Felix and his girlfriend Fanny convince the other couple that nice things are nice, and that rich condo people's money will enrich them all. Bob takes Calvin out for lunch, where he convinces the guy with the musical number. Meanwhile, the kids are at the wharf trying to enjoy the rides when Tina discovers her favorite merry-go-round horse, Mr. Goiter, is being destroyed with the rest of the ride. So Louise chains Tina to the ride, and the protest attracts the attention of the media, whose swarm of the area starts to draw the attention of the wharf's destruction. When Bob sees the protest and realizes how important the wharf is to his family, he changes his mind and takes Calvin on the roller coaster where they see the whole wharf from above, and Fischoeder changes his mind too. but Felix is still intent on selling the wharf, so he kidnaps Bob and Calvin at gunpoint, tying them up beneath the wharf to let the high tide drown them. World War II, The Wharfening. Bob and Calvin are tied up beneath the wharf, desperately trying to escape the situation by sending a message to the family on Bob's old phone. The family gets this text and starts to wonder about what it means, with the phone calls being garbled due to the noise of the wharf, while the texts are unreadable due to Bob not being able to see what he's sending. Eventually, they resort to simply asking around the town, ultimately winding up back at Wonder Wharf, where they meet Felix, who has been getting increasingly guilty, and his nervousness tips them off to the idea that something's wrong. Ultimately, Linda is able to identify the noise of the wharf itself as being part of the background noise from Bob's calls, and they deduce that he's beneath their feet. So they rent some boats to search for him, eventually discovering the duo just before the tide comes in. But Fanny arrives with a gun to stop them from shattering her dreams of having her own nightclub, and she's stopped by the wharf itself collapsing on their heads. In the end, the Fish Odor brothers pin the entire thing on Fanny while paying off the Belchers to keep quiet. Mr. Fish Odor, the other one, Calvin, has always had a hidden soft spot for the kitschy appeal of small businesses and honest work, such as what one can find at Bob's Burgers. But just because he has this soft spot doesn't mean he's not a shrewd businessman at his core. And these two ideals clash with one another during the episode as Bob serves unknowingly as his moral compass. At first, Bob represents the hard-working aesthetic of what Calvin enjoys about the wharf, but when Bob himself is the one to try to appeal to Calvin's sense of greed in order to have the wharf sold off, this foundation is shattered as he sees the representation of those values rejecting itself. But when Bob has a change of heart and Calvin is able to literally put his work into perspective, he goes back into the mentality of believing there are some things that money can't buy. Tina's memories of her favorite horse on the merry-go-round, Gene overcoming his fear of a roller coaster after it nearly crushed him in the first season, and Louise being eager to make new memories just as her siblings have all made, make him realize that once you have enough money, you can afford a few bad financial decisions in order to purchase happiness, if not for himself, then at least for others. But this is still a burgeoning feeling. He hasn't quite figured out why he finds this appeal to exist where it does, and clashes against Felix, who is likewise becoming more like his brother as he too starts to realize how many dreams he's crushing in order to support his own. Felix feels guilty for what is likely the first time in his life, his inferiority complex manifesting fresh as he starts to realize that his brother has things he does not, and that by getting even more money, he's not actually getting any closer to that thing. And all of this is put into an episode that marks the show itself accepting its transition into a quasi-musical. There have been diegetic songs in Bob's Burgers up to this point when a character singing represents their singing, and if there's an in-universe concert. But Bob singing to convince Fish Odor, while acknowledging the show as a song, is still used in the same context as a musical, or an elevated expression of a character's emotions or desires, and it's acknowledged as such. Outro. This was a part 1 to what will probably be a 3-part series on Bob's Burgers, continuing on to cover through the movie as a natural endpoint, and then likely taking a break until there are enough seasons to do a video of this length once again. It's interesting to see the preliminary reactions to my coverage of Bob's Burgers so far. A lot of people have mentioned that it's a good comfort show, the type of thing to have on in the background that you watch again and again, be it for background noise while you're working, to help with sleep, or just drowning out the years of tinnitus like I do. And I've always tried to make this channel achieve that same effect, background noise, or something for a second screen while you do something else. For me, I watched a lot of Berman-era Star Trek while I worked on this. And after watching a bit more Bob's Burgers in preparation for this video, it started to loop back around to being a comfort show for me again. The part 2 of this video will come out in about 2 months-ish. Part 3 will probably be a full-length version in like 4, 5-ish, I don't really know at this point. Channel members can get individual parts of these videos early, just one season at a time, as I finish them. And this whole section is going to be cut out of the full-length version of the video, it's an outro, so unless this video is unlisted, then that's not up yet. I guess I will see you in whenever. I don't know. I don't have an outro written, so I'm just saying stuff.